The protagonist was born into a poor peasant family that lived far away from cities, among mountain ranges surrounded by dense forests and green hills. Every day his parents rose at first light to tend the tiny field that was their only source of sustenance. His father had suffered from poor health since childhood, and the disease that had plagued him for years had gradually drained his strength. From time to time he tried to work to help the family, but it cost him a lot of effort, and it soon became apparent that his days were numbered. When the protagonist was a child, his father passed away, leaving his mother and son alone. Left alone, the child and his mother continued to cultivate the field, trying not only to keep the farm, but also to survive in conditions when every penny and every piece of bread was worth its weight in gold. Each year the protagonist became stronger and more agile, gradually beginning to take on more and more work. It seemed that their life, though hard, was predictable and stable. But when the protagonist was 12 years old, fate dealt him a cruel blow again. His mother, who had always been a support and light for him, suddenly fell ill. The disease came quickly and unexpectedly, like a black cloud hanging over their home. Despite all attempts to find medicine and help, his mother's condition worsened every day. Soon it became clear that she too would leave this world, leaving the protagonist all alone. On her deathbed, holding onto his hand, she said her last words to him that would remain with him forever. There was sadness and regret in her voice. She regretted that she could not do more for her son, that she could not protect him from all the hardships of life. However, her last words were a farewell and a blessing. She asked him to live the life he wanted, to follow his own path, not the one predetermined for him by fate. Years passed, and one day in one of the narrow streets, Nola was approached by Mrs. Stella, a middle-aged woman with a kind face and soft eyes. She was always ready to help those in need, and this time she wanted to thank Noel for the help he had given her earlier. Noel, who was not used to praise, was embarrassed and only thanked her for her support, which was important to him in difficult times. Not far from them, at the edge of the street, stood a little girl who had a delicate face with big sad eyes. The girl looked around hesitantly, as if she was looking for someone to help her, but eventually she timidly stepped towards Noel. She came closer and in a low, almost whispering voice told him that she had lost her kitten. This kitten was her best friend and often accompanied her in her daily games, but he had a habit of running away from home. It was not the first time this had happened, and the girl knew that she would have to look for him again. But each time the process gave her a lot of anxiety. Noel, seeing her anxiety and realizing how important it was to her, gently leaned over and asked if the kitten had run away again. The girl only nodded sadly, unable to hold back the tears that were slowly beginning to fill her eyes. Noel smiled at her with kindness and warmth and assured her that he would find the kitten before sunset. These simple words were like magic that brought hope back to the girl, and her face lit up with a wide smile. Continuing along the narrow, winding streets of the town, Noel was absorbed in his thoughts when suddenly he came upon a young boy carrying a large sack full of bright, fresh apples. The guy, upon seeing Noel, instantly recognized him and remembered how he had recently accidentally bothered him during one of his errands. This unpleasant memory made him scratch the back of his head in embarrassment, and, wishing to make amends, he immediately took one of the largest apples from his basket. Holding it out to Noel, the boy apologized, hoping that this small gift would help make amends. Noel, slightly surprised by the gesture but pleasantly touched, gratefully accepted the apple. He thanked the guy and said he was always happy to help if he had any need. The boy nodded his appreciation with a smile and then continued on his way down the dusty road, carrying his bag of fruit farther down the street. On his way, Noel noticed two men laboring on the roof of one of the old houses. One of them, sitting on the very edge of the roof, had his legs stretched out and was watching curiously what was going on below. He was the first to notice Nola and, raising his hand in a welcoming gesture, asked how he was doing. His face was covered with dust and sweat, but he had a good-natured smile in his eyes. Noel glanced up and replied briefly that everything was still the same. He continued to work at the local factory, running the small errands the townsfolk assigned him. The second man, who stood a little higher up, busy laying tiles, paused for a moment to listen to the conversation. He shook his head and, with a slight smile, remarked that no one in the town did his work as neatly and quickly as Noel. With these words he asked him to come and help next time if he was free, for his skill was always worth its weight in gold. Noel nodded in response to the request, promising that he would always be happy to help if the need arose. His gaze was calm, with no unnecessary emotion in it, as if those words had come out of his mouth many times before. Over the years, he had grown accustomed to people around him making requests of him, and he never left them unheeded. There was no wealth or fame in his life, but a constant willingness to support those in need. With these thoughts in mind, Noel moved on, heading towards the guild where he ran his usual errands. This place was like a separate world, separated from the hustle and bustle of the city. Here the destinies of adventurers intersected, each coming with their own dreams, fears, and goals. As soon as Null entered the guild, he was met at the counter by a man who was almost the symbol of this place. Tall, with a thick dark beard and a deep, penetrating gaze, he always looked at visitors as if he could see right through them. This man was not in the habit of asking unnecessary questions, but always knew who was doing what and how serious his intentions were. When Null came closer, the man wasted no time and immediately asked if he had finished all the tasks he had been assigned. His voice was even, but there was a familiar sternness in it that emphasized his experience and position. Null, without saying too much, handed the man a piece of paper, a small scrap of paper that was the result of his few days of work. This document was not remarkable at first glance, but it contained all the important details of his labor. The man accepted the paper and slowly unfolded it, beginning to read each line with the attention he was accustomed to giving to all his tasks. His eyes ran over the text, but no emotion was visible on his face. It seemed to be a routine for him, but Null knew that behind that restraint lurked respect. When the man reached the end, he nodded briefly, acknowledging the work as finished. Without further ado, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins that were his payment for the tasks he had completed. These coins were small in number, but to Nola they meant much more. It was his opportunity to continue living in this world. Null took the coins, thanked the man briefly, and without lingering, said that it was time for him to move on. His voice was calm, but it held the same weariness he felt every day. The man behind the counter nodded, but before Null could leave, reminded him to be careful. He advised Null not to overwork himself or put his life in unnecessary danger, for he knew that there were often more difficulties in life than met the eye. The guy standing in the guild looked after the departing Null and then turned to the owner behind the counter that Null had just been chatting with. He nodded his head toward Null, indicating that he wanted to say something about him. The young man opened his mouth and, with a slight surprise in his voice, began to talk about how Null was doing random part-time jobs that seemed insignificant against other missions, yet the guild continued to trust him with these tasks. It seemed strange to him that despite the insignificance of these errands, the guild still handed them over to Null specifically. The man behind the counter, upon hearing this, only smiled slightly as if he wasn't surprised. He knew that Nola had a special status in the guild that few people were aware of. The man turned to the guy and asked him if he knew what the lowest rank existed in the guild. The guy thought for a moment, his eyebrows furrowed as if he was trying to remember something important. After a pause, he suggested that it was probably rank E, meant for beginners. This was the most standard answer that came to mind for most newbies, as rank E was indeed considered the minimum rank for those who were just starting out on their adventurer's journey. The man behind the counter looked at the boy and nodded, confirming his guess about Nola's rank. But then, as if to add an unexpected note to the conversation, he said something he hadn't expected to hear. He said quietly that Nola's rank was even lower than anyone had guessed. It wasn't just a rank for beginners, not the E rank that everyone thought was the lowest. Null possessed rank F, and it was a title so rare and obscure that even many guild veterans had never heard of its existence. The guy hearing these words couldn't hide his surprise. His eyes widened, he raised his eyebrows and involuntarily opened his mouth, realizing that he had been informed of something completely unexpected. It was a strange discovery for him, as he had always thought he knew the ins and outs of the ranking system. The man, noticing the boy's confusion, decided to explain the situation in more detail, realizing that such news required further explanation. He began to tell him that rank F was a special rank that was often referred to as peripheral or unknown. People with this rank did not have the ability to take on the normal missions that were available to other adventurers. They had no tasks at their disposal that involved subduing, exploring, or gathering valuable resources outside the city. They were strictly forbidden from leaving the safe zones of the city and engaging in dangerous adventures that promised fame and fortune. The only thing such people were allowed to do was to work part-time within the city, performing routine but necessary tasks. It was the only way for them to make a living and sustain their existence. Their backgrounds were so poor that it was as if it predetermined their fate before they could even take their first step in life. They were born into families where every grain was worth its weight in gold and every day was a struggle for survival. The F rank was specifically created for those like them, those who could not afford the luxury of choice. This rank provided them with some way to make a living without putting themselves in danger. The boy, to whom more and more previously unknown details were revealed with each new explanation, could not hide his confusion. He felt that a whole stratum of life was being revealed to him that he had not even realized. His thoughts were confused, and in an attempt to clarify the situation to the end, he asked the question again. He wanted to understand why ordinary citizens and even many adventurers knew nothing about the existence of such a rank. It seemed illogical to him, and he couldn't imagine that such information could be withheld intentionally. The man behind the counter, hearing the question, frowned for a moment. He was clearly contemplating whether or not to go ahead and reveal the secret, because not everyone was ready to learn the truth about how the world worked. A shadow of doubt flashed in his eyes, but then he quietly began to explain after making up his mind. He explained that the rank system in the guild was a fragile and carefully balanced structure. If people were to learn of the existence of F rank, if they were made aware that there were those whose abilities were so limited, it could undermine the system's credibility. In the adventurer's world, it was important to maintain the illusion of equal opportunity, where everyone could succeed with enough effort. Rank F shattered this illusion because it embodied a reality where not everyone could become a hero. The guild itself did its best to keep this knowledge secret, so as not to upset the delicate balance between those who fought for glory and those who could barely sustain their existence. The man added that in all his years in the guild, he had only met one person with that rank, and that person was Null. This made it unique and tragic at the same time, because Null didn't have the opportunities that were open to others. The man's words plunged the boy into deep thought. He looked at Null with a new understanding, realizing that he was not like all the other adventurers. The lad began to wonder about the life path Null had chosen, why he hadn't tried to fight the system, why he hadn't sought a way out beyond the limitations that had been imposed upon him. Unable to restrain his curiosity, the boy asked another question that had been plaguing him for a long time. He wanted to know why Null didn't try to improve his skills like many other adventurers do. In the guild where those who dreamed of great feats and unearthly glory came, sooner or later everyone was given the opportunity to go to the training center. This center was more than just a place of training, it was a symbol of a new beginning, a chance for everyone to test their strength and see what they could become in this world. There were 6 great classes in the training center, each representing a certain strength and skill. The swordsman was a master swordsman whose movements were swift and precise like the dance of steel. The hunter was a stealthy and skillful archer whose marksmanship and caution helped him survive in the most dangerous conditions. Priest, a guardian of light whose magical abilities were focused on healing and protecting his comrades. Warrior, invincible in battle, his strength and fortitude knew no equal. Thief, agile and cunning, master of stealthy attacks and evasive maneuvers. The mage was a master of ancient spells, whose powers could change the course of battle with a single wave of the hand. Each of these classes was unique, and each offered the adventurer endless opportunities for self-improvement. But in order to become a part of one of these classes, a person had to go through a rigorous selection process. It wasn't just a selection, it was a test of mind and body. The training center was where skills were honed and character was formed. Those who couldn't master any of the classes couldn't even apply for guild missions. This was a key stage in the life of any aspiring adventurer. Only by passing this test could a person claim the right to be called an adventurer and go on missions that could lead to fame or fortune. The man behind the counter, looking at the boy, raised his eyebrows thoughtfully. His face, previously calm, suddenly became serious, as if old memories were surfacing in him. He asked if the guy remembered the E-rank exam, and he nodded briefly. The images of that exam, the moment when the fate of every newcomer was decided, instantly flashed through his mind. After all, to be considered a full-fledged adventurer, a person had to master at least one skill that allowed him to survive in the harsh conditions of the world. Those who had been trained in the training center did not leave there empty-handed. They left with new knowledge, skills that became their weapons in the upcoming tests. The boy thought for a moment, staring at the space in front of him, and his thoughts gradually filled with questions about Nola. Because maybe Nola had reasons why he couldn't go there that no one knew about. These thoughts kept him on his toes, and he asked the man behind the counter this question. The man, upon hearing the question, shook his head slightly as if he had anticipated it. He knew that this conversation might disappoint the boy, for the truth was not what he expected. With a slight sadness in his voice, the man began to explain that Null had already gone through this journey. He had also gone to the training center, full of determination and confidence that he could change his destiny. He was one of those who believed that hard work and perseverance could overcome any obstacle. Null dreamed of becoming a strong adventurer, to one day go outside the city and fight monsters, to find the treasures that legends spoke of. The man was silent for a moment, as if he was gripped by memories of the days when Null first came to the training center. He had seen his eagerness, his hopes, and it had left an imprint on his soul. The memories were as fresh as if it had been yesterday. He remembered how Null had tried, how he had endeavored, how he had believed in his success. But day after day his dreams had crumbled under the weight of reality. It was a difficult time, both for Null himself and for those who watched his progress, hoping for a miracle that never came. Meanwhile, Null continued his journey through the deserted streets of the city, unaware that his fate was being discussed behind his back. Each step he took was difficult, but in his heart lived the belief that his path was different from the paths of others. He knew that his destiny was not tied to the ordinary life of an adventurer, but that didn't stop him. He went forward, step by step, accepting the challenges of fate with an open heart, ready to face whatever the future had in store for him. The man behind the counter, having completed his memories, came back to the present. His voice had grown quieter, but it still held the same determination and wisdom as before. He spoke his last words as if summarizing his story of Nola. He said that in the guild's opinion, Null really didn't have the skills that were necessary for the life of an adventurer. But that didn't make him any less important, for every person in this world had their place. Null approached the construction site, where piles of stones lay strewn about, dust in the air, making it seem as if the air itself was filled with heaviness and earth. In places the ground was trampled so that the stones and dust blended into a gray mass, and there was a silent but palpable tension all around. It was business as usual, and Null was already used to this picture that greeted him every day. The workers noticed him as soon as he approached. One of them, leaving his sack behind, gestured that Null was on time again. His face showed relief, for on days like this every worker was worth his weight in gold, and Null was never late and was always ready to work. As soon as he walked a little farther, an older man approached him. His weathered and haggard face, covered with deep wrinkles, spoke of years spent in similar jobs. He nodded to Null, expressing his satisfaction at his arrival, explaining that the lack of workers had become a real problem for them. Pointing to the construction site, he remarked that workers were badly needed now, and said that Null was the only one who had responded to the guild's assignment. Null didn't linger on the conversation, nodding briefly and rushing off to the stack of bags of cement. His shoulders took the weight of the load habitually, as they had many times before. He began carrying the bags one by one, moving in step with the rest of the workers, where each step was practiced to the point of automaticity. For hours they silently and diligently stacked the sacks on top of each other, creating even rows. Each of them knew that even the slightest mistake could cause the entire structure to collapse, and so the work required the utmost concentration. After hours of continuous work, they finally took a break. Null sat down on a nearby rock, leaning against it, feeling his muscles begin to relax after a busy day. The other workers crouched around him as well, some reclining lazily on sacks, some drinking water greedily to quench their thirst. For a few minutes the construction site fell into silence, broken only by occasional sighs and the rustling of the wind that played with the raised dust. But Null soon caught the sound of muffled voices nearby. He listened and turned around to see two young boys standing off to the side. One of them was saying something excitedly, trying to convince the other. Null turned around to see who it was. Two guys appeared before him, one with a frowning face and taut shoulders, as if he was ready for a fight. The other, on the contrary, seemed calm, but in his eyes you could read determination and confidence. They stood at the edge of the construction site, almost beyond where the noise was quieter, and were discussing something heatedly. Null listened to their conversation, and the subject of their argument soon became clear. One of the boys was urging the other to give up his ambition to become an adventurer. He spoke of the dangers, of the deadly risks that await anyone who decides to embark on this path. His voice was full of bitterness, as if he had been through it himself and now wanted to protect his friend from disappointment. But the other boy, who looked much younger and more hopeful, didn't give up. He assured him that, despite all the dangers, he was willing to try. There was no doubt in his words, only a strong desire. He had already mastered the two basic skills that gave him some sort of advantage, and now he was determined to move on, to go forward toward his dream. Despite his friend's warnings, Null had heard him talk about how everyone should have a chance, even if it meant taking a risk. The older boy who tried to persuade his friend remained adamant. He continued to assure that a true adventurer must have a special aura, a special power that couldn't be faked or obtained simply through training. Ordinary people like them were born to work here on the construction site, not to strive for greatness and glory, because that could only bring pain and disappointment. His words sounded harsh, but in them you could catch the fear for his friend, the worry for his future. This conversation awakened dark and bitter memories in Nola. Listening to their argument, he recalled his own youthful dreams and ambitions. How often he himself had thought of overcoming his limitations and becoming something greater. As a boy, he too had dreamed of being adventurous, of training and earning a place among the best. But all he had were just dreams and perseverance. Immersed in his thoughts, Null sat motionless, as if the whole world around him had frozen. His eyes seemed to be looking far away, not at the surrounding construction site, where the workers were still moving, but into his own past. His memory took him back to a time when things had been different, when he had been a child, full of hopes and dreams. It was one of those moments that had been imprinted on his mind forever, a moment that had shaped his entire existence. He clearly remembered that day as if it had happened only yesterday. He was standing on the training ground in the bright sunshine, his small hands clutching the hilt of a wooden sword. Back then, as a child, he had approached his teacher with a single request, to let him stay and practice with the sword some more. It seemed to him that if he put in more effort, if he invested even more time and energy, he could achieve mastery. However, the teacher, looking at Nola, could not support his zeal. There was a sadness in his gaze that hid the experience of long years and thousands of similar students. He discreetly but firmly told Nola that it was all useless, that no amount of extra training would help him. It was a blow to Nola's faith in his own strength. These words were not said to humiliate or disappoint him, but because the teacher knew how important realism was in training. He saw the boy try, he saw his heart burning, but he also knew that Nola had no natural talent for becoming a swordsman. The teacher added that not giving up until the last minute was a sign of a strong spirit, and that perhaps one day Nola would benefit from that determination. But the reality was that months of training passed and Null never learned a single fighting skill. With his head down, Null felt the weight of adversity and disappointment hanging over him like a heavy cloud descending lower and lower. His thoughts wandered in a chaotic swirl of doubts, each one leading him farther and farther away from self-confidence. But just as these thoughts began to fill his mind, a teacher standing nearby caught a glimpse of this depressed mood. The teacher, who had watched over Null throughout the years, could not allow his student to drown in a swamp of frustration. He felt an obligation to keep the fire that had once burned in Null's heart alive. The teacher walked over to him, leaned over, and gently, but insistently, asked him to keep his hands up. He spoke of how the world was not limited by talent or lack thereof, that there were many paths to follow, and that even if Null was not endowed with a natural aptitude for fencing, it did not mean that he was doomed to failure. He suggested that Null look at his situation from a different perspective. In the world of martial arts, there were rumors that were passed down by word of mouth like ancient legends. It was said that if one practiced one skill long enough, if one showed enough persistence, that skill could evolve into something new, something previously unknown. Even though these were rumors, there was some truth to them, and the teacher believed that Null could be an example of someone who, through his own efforts, could surpass his own limitations. The teacher standing in front of Null looked at his student with a warm but wise smile that read not only support but also a deep understanding of the world. This man had been through a lot and knew very well that in life not always the one with the greatest talent wins. His gaze was penetrating, as if he could see through Nola's failures and foresee his possible future. The teacher said that even if Nola didn't have an innate talent like many other students, it didn't mean he was doomed to failure. He went on to explain that everyone has their own challenges, and even those with natural ability often face problems that cannot be solved by talent alone. He said that Nola's character was something that could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable to most. And this quality, which was evident in his perseverance and willingness to keep practicing despite all setbacks, was already a talent in itself. The teacher suggested that Null try to go somewhere else, find new opportunities for training, and keep working on himself, ignoring external setbacks. Null, still a child, with his eyes wide open and his heart full of hope, happily agreed to the teacher's suggestion. In these words he found the inspiration he had been missing. He knew the journey would be difficult, but at that moment his spirit was determined to keep moving forward, to seek and fight, no matter how long it took. However, no matter how hard Null tried, no matter how many training places he visited, all of his efforts led him to the same conclusion. He had no natural talent that would allow him to advance in the way he dreamed of. He saw other students, those who had the gift, quickly learning new techniques, making leaps and bounds in their development, while Null stayed where he was. Each time he came to a new training ground, he felt hope slipping away from him, and each time he faced the same truth again and again. He did not have the abilities that would allow him to reach the level of a true master. His dream of becoming an adventurer, someone who fights monsters and protects the weak, was becoming more and more distant, like a mirage on the horizon that he would never be able to reach. This realization depressed him, but he couldn't allow himself to just give up. He knew that if he lacked talent, the only way to succeed was through the strength of his spirit. Null was convinced that his perseverance and determination could make up for his lack of ability. He decided that if he had no natural gift, his spirit must be much stronger than others, and that he would continue to improve his skills until he reached perfection. Every day he returned to the training ground, his body exhausted, but his heart continued to beat with the same vigor. He struck again and again at the branches that were his silent enemies. Each time he struck, it was as if he was tearing apart his own doubts and fears. With each blow he was trying to overcome his limitations, to prove to himself and the world that he was capable of more than everyone thought. Of all the skills he learned at the training center, only a few stayed with him. These skills, like gems, were engraved in his memory, and he repeated them over and over again, trying to perfect them. He couldn't afford to forget what his teacher had taught him. Those lessons weren't just techniques to him, but something deeper, a reminder that even without natural talent, you can achieve something significant if you don't give up. His teacher had told him that if you practiced long enough, you could discover a new skill, and Noel clung to that promise like a lifeline. It was an idea based on rumors, based on someone else's stories, but it gave him the strength to keep going. Each new day was similar to the previous one, the same training, the same kicks, the same struggle with the branches and his fears. But Noel didn't give up, and that was the most important thing. The year passed, but Noel didn't stop his training. His body began to adapt to the constant strain. His muscles grew stronger and his blows more accurate. Now he could easily chop 10 limbs with a single sword stroke, and for an ordinary man that would be a great achievement. But for Noel it was only a small milestone in his journey. He knew that it wasn't enough, that he had to keep working to achieve his dream. Each day his movements became more polished, his punches more powerful, but even that didn't bring him satisfaction. He felt that there was progress, but that progress was too slow. Noel often caught himself in the same thought: if he continued with the same determination and persistence, he would undoubtedly succeed. The thought burned brightly in his mind that one day, if he continued to train, improve his skills and stay on track, he could become what he dreamed of, a true adventurer. Every time he stood on the training ground or performed his routine tasks, this thought never left him, as if his mind kept coming back to it again and again, keeping him in a state of expectation of a miracle. Each day that passed in training and hard work brought him a new sense of hope. So 3 years passed, and although they flew by in continuous training, Noel began to notice that his skills had improved greatly. His body seemed to take on a rhythm of its own. It became accustomed to the exertion, and became part of the training itself. Whereas at first he had struggled to hold a sword, now his muscles could easily withstand long hours of practice. Particularly noticeable was his progress in parrying. Once, it had seemed an impossible task, a skill he could not master, but now he could parry hundreds of twigs with a single blow. It was a kind of culmination of his training, a result toward which he was moving slowly but surely. Despite this success, Noel realized that it was only one skill, and that parrying alone was not enough to become what he dreamed of being. This skill, even if perfected, could not make him a complete adventurer. He realized that he had to master many other skills to achieve his goal, but each new step was difficult for him. Each time he reflected on his training, Noel realized that his time was running out. He felt that he had to improve faster or he would never reach his goal. 10 long years had passed since that conversation with his teacher when Noel first heard that perseverance could trump talent. These words, once so reassuring, had become a kind of mantra for him, which he repeated to himself every time doubt crept up on his soul. Over the years, Noel had worn out thousands of swords, each one a mute witness to his struggle, not only with branches and trees, but with his own doubts. Each time another sword broke under his blows, Noel felt his resolve grow stronger, but at the same time something inside him weakened. He left these broken swords behind him as silent monuments to his hard work. They lay there, a reminder of the time he had dedicated to his goal, the effort he had put into each of his strikes. But with each new sword he replaced, Noel felt more and more clearly that his faith in success was beginning to wane. He was becoming a master at parrying, his movements becoming so fast and precise that they could rival the best swordsmen. But this skill, which had reached near perfection, now seemed useless to him without other skills. He realized that his skill at parrying was not what would make him a great adventurer. Despite all these doubts, Noel could not afford to just give up. He decided to go to the city and apply to the Adventurers Guild, hoping that there would be a place for him there. This step did not come easily to Noel. Admitting to himself that his skills were far from perfect was excruciating. But he knew he had to at least try. He couldn't allow himself to give up without trying every possible avenue. Arriving at the guild, he excitedly approached the master, asking him for a chance. Noel felt that this was the moment he had trained for all these years. The master, although he saw that Noel was far from being as good as other adventurers, still agreed to give him a chance. However, after Null received the title, he soon realized that his basic fighting skills, which he had honed over decades, were useless in most everyday situations. However, to his surprise, Null discovered that some of the secondary skills he had learned during his training were far more useful than he had ever thought. One of these skills was strength enhancement, which he had learned in the warrior class. This skill allowed him to lift 5 times more weight than a normal person. At first glance, this seemed insignificant, but in practice, this skill made Nola indispensable in physical jobs such as construction and carrying heavy loads. This skill gave him the ability to earn a living, as well as the realization that his abilities were not useless. Another useful skill that proved to be unexpectedly important was healing, which Null learned in the priest class. This skill allowed him to recover more quickly from long and grueling days of work. Instead of spending several days resting and recovering, Null could quickly heal his body and get back to work. This made him more productive and allowed him to endure much greater exertion than others. The stealth skill that Null learned during his training in the thief class proved unexpectedly useful, not in combat fights as he had imagined, but in the simplest of seemingly everyday tasks. His ability to move silently, to hide from sight and become invisible in crowds or open spaces, played a key role in a completely unexpected area, finding lost animals. The flame skill Null had learned in mage class was also useful, though its application was far from the grand battles he had dreamed of in his youth. This skill saved him more than once in everyday situations when he needed to quickly build a fire in rainy weather or light a dark corner. Stone throwing, a skill he learned in his hunter class, was a real surprise in Nola's life. He had not often used the skill for its intended purpose, either for hunting or in combat, as the class had suggested. However, the skill found an unexpected use when children in town began asking Nola to show them his abilities. Several other minor skills that Null learned during his training also proved useful in his daily life. They made him more productive and efficient in his work, and although they did not bring him fame or fortune, these skills helped him earn a living. However, despite all these useful skills, the one skill that Null never used in real-life situations was his favorite, parrying. This skill, which he had honed over the years, proved to be unnecessary in his daily life as an adventurer. However, Null could not bring himself to completely forget about it. He continued to practice the technique, not because he expected to use it someday, but because he didn't want to forget what he had been through. Even though he no longer needed the skill, it remained an important part of his identity for Nola. It was his way of remembering that he didn't break, that he kept moving forward despite all the setbacks. However, the days continued to pass monotonously. Nola's life became a quiet but somewhat monotonous existence. Every day he did his job, helped people, and used his skills, but he felt that something was missing. He realized that his dream of being an adventurer in the full sense of the word had already come true. He had gained a title, earned respect, and was able to find his place in the world. But at the same time, he realized that his life had become too predictable. He had achieved what he wanted, but this success did not bring him the sense of fullness of life that he had expected. Suddenly, one of his co-workers approached him. He interrupted his musings by reminding him that his work time was coming to an end. Null felt himself returning to reality, as if he had surfaced from a deep ocean of thoughts, and reciprocated the remark. The colleague, with a slight chuckle, remarked that Null had been working here for almost 3 months, and was indeed performing well. But he also added that it was a waste of time to live like this, despite the efficiency. These words made Null think. Although he was happy with his life, his colleague raised a question that had long been hiding in the back of his mind. The coworker, crossing his arms over his chest and leaning toward Null, scrutinized his reaction to the suggestion. His voice sounded soft but firm as he suggested that Null leave his current job as an adventurer and go to work for him, hinting that a stable life and a good paycheck would be a far better alternative for him than the daily dangers. He continued, adding that perhaps Null was having some trouble in the guild. The man explained that if Null became his official employee, his salary would be 3 times higher than what he was getting at the guild. These words sounded tempting, especially considering that Null's life, though filled with training and small tasks, did not bring in much income. Null, despite the apparent generosity of the offer, thanked his colleague for his concern. He gratefully accepted the offer, but politely declined. Null explained that he was quite comfortable with the way his life was going now. The coworker, hearing the refusal, rubbed his head in a gesture of slight disappointment. He had expected this response, but still couldn't hide his concern for Null. The man gave Null his number in case he ever changed his mind. There was hope in his voice that Null would still reconsider his views on life. Thanking his colleague for the offer, Null assured him that they would definitely meet tomorrow at the same job. He felt that his path as an adventurer was his true calling, despite all the obstacles that stood before him. When Null left the construction site, his thoughts were filled with reflections on life and what would come next. He walked through the narrow city streets, pondering how he could intensify his training to become even stronger. He knew that his skills were not enough, that he had to improve if he wanted to reach the heights he dreamed of. Suddenly, his musings were interrupted by a strange light that appeared behind him. The light was bright and pulsing, as if something from another world had intruded on the usual course of things. Null stopped, wondering what it could be. He turned around and saw something completely unexpected. The light seemed to come from an unknown source, piercing the night darkness like a sword tearing through the veil of reality. Following the light, Null heard voices full of despair and fear. They came from somewhere in the darkness, as if invisible figures were calling for help. The voices permeated the air, making Null uneasy. He froze, trying to figure out where they were coming from and what exactly was happening. Everything around him was suddenly alien, as if reality had shifted and Null found himself in the midst of something unknown. Suddenly, a creature the likes of which he had never seen before appeared before him. A huge black buffalo, so huge that its massive figure towered over the houses. This monster was incredibly large, its eyes glowing with fury and its horns gleaming in the light of the street lamps like metal blades. Null could not take his eyes off this monstrous figure. This creature was not just a large animal. It looked like the embodiment of darkness itself, a power that knew no bounds. The buffalo was truly gigantic. Its height could reach the roof of a house, and every step it took was like a hammer hitting the ground. Every movement made the earth tremble. It was the first time Null had ever seen such a creature. He stood there, amazed to the core. Null shifted his gaze and noticed that directly in front of the buffalo stood a group of Imperial soldiers. Their armor, gleaming in the sun, was familiar to Null. He had seen these warriors before, knowing that they served under the banners of the Empire, always fighting on the front lines of the most dangerous battles. They surrounded the girl, frail and frightened, who looked as if the world around her had collapsed in an instant. Her face was contorted with terror, but she stood without moving, huddled against the wall of the nearest house, seeking protection from these soldiers. The soldiers exchanged quick commands, their voices full of tension. They were preparing to attack, trying to figure out how best to approach this monster, how to stop it. However, their plans fell apart in a split second when the buffalo rushed forward like lightning. Its huge axe flashed through the air like a merciless blade slicing through everything in its path. In the next second, the blade of the axe blew off the head of one of the soldiers with terrifying ease. Blood spurted from the neck, and the body collapsed to the ground like a broken doll. Null was stunned. He had never seen anyone kill so easily, with such a bestial, primal urge for destruction. The buffalo didn't even slow down, as if this killing was a minor event to him, not an act of violence. A single blow and the man's life no longer existed. The strength with which the creature attacked seemed beyond human comprehension. Suddenly, Null noticed that the monster directed its vicious gaze at the girl. Its eyes burned with rage, and it was clear that she was its next target. Null realized that if he didn't intervene now, the girl would die. Her chances of survival were slim to none. She wouldn't have time to escape from such a fast and powerful creature. Without thinking of himself, Null rushed forward. At that moment, his instincts took over, and he decided to use one of the few skills that could help in any way. He grabbed a rock from the ground, hoping he could distract the monster for at least a moment. That stone was his only weapon at that moment, and all hope was that this throw would allow the girl to escape. Concentrating, Null threw the stone with the same precision he had once used to entertain children in the city. The stone flew in an arc and struck the side of the buffalo with force. The blow was weak, but enough to attract the beast's attention. The buffalo stopped, its eyes lighting up with a new fury. Now all of its anger was directed at Null. Null was the center of this monster's attention, and now he had to find a way to survive. The buffalo let out a menacing roar and swung his massive axe, pointing it directly at Null. The ground shook under the weight of the impact, and dust kicked up in the air, forming a cloud that obscured everything around. Null barely had time to scramble away, instinctively realizing that a collision with the axe would have ended in his death. Null suddenly felt a rush of cold realization. Even if he could fend off the blow of the monster's huge axe, his chances of survival were slim to none. This terrifying force with which the monster threw its blows was too great for a mere man. The buffalo, enraged and confused, raised his huge axe again, preparing to deliver another crushing blow. The axe, massive and deadly, came down again with terrifying speed and force. The ground beneath Null's feet trembled slightly from the approaching blow. The air tingled with tension, as if the world itself were trying to warn of impending doom. But Null, straining every muscle in his weary body, raised his sword again and repelled the attack. A mixture of anger and bewilderment glittered in the buffalo's inhuman eyes. He was used to tearing his enemies apart in one fell swoop, leaving only death and destruction in his wake. Null seemed to him to be nothing more than another victim to be felled by the first blow. But now the buffalo could feel his own rage growing as this little creature dared to stand up to him. Each blow that Null repelled seemed more and more unbearable to him. The vibration of the blow traveled through his body, leaving traces of pain and fatigue. Null's sword, though it held, trembled under the weight of the axe, and it seemed to shake more and more with each successive blow, threatening to destroy it. Null realized that he would not last much longer. The buffalo was incredibly strong. Its blows possessed not only terrifying power but also frightening speed, making every movement of the monster deadly. Every time Null raised his sword to meet another attack, he felt as if his own weapon was about to fall apart. The sword seemed unable to cope with the weight of his opponent, and with each strike, its balance was upset more and more. Nola's thoughts were racing, searching for a plan, a way out of this seemingly hopeless situation. Time was running out. The monster wasn't going to give him a break. Null knew that if he didn't find the monster's weak spot in the next few moments, he would be doomed. He tried to analyze the giant's every move, hoping to discern a hint of vulnerability in its behavior. The monster moved with surprising speed and precision for a creature of such size. Its attacks seemed to carry a raw force of nature. Despite years of training and hardening, its blade was but steel created by the hands of man, and the monster's axe seemed to be an instrument of destruction of time itself. Suddenly, the monster changed its target. The huge buffalo, as if sensing a new source of threat or simply deciding that Null was no longer a threat, turned sharply toward the girl who had been standing nearby until that moment. Her body was paralyzed with fear, and Null could clearly see that she wouldn't be able to escape in time. Everything inside him clenched as he realized that the monster had directed its deadly fury at her. Null rushed forward, standing between the monster and the girl like a last shield, ready to meet death just to give her a chance of escape. As the buffalo's axe swiftly came down, Null raised his sword, barely in time to deflect the blow. The clash of the two blades caused a rumble that seemed to echo throughout the area. The vibration from the impact traveled through his entire body, leaving his hands numb. But Null kept himself on his feet. He realized that this sword could not withstand any more attacks like this. With each new collision, the sword blade crackled as if warning of its imminent doom. The buffalo, overflowing with rage like the embodiment of an ancient power, was unwilling to stop. Its roar echoed through the deserted terrain, filling the air with fear and terror. With each new blow his fury only increased, and Null saw it clearly in the monster's eyes. The buffalo swung his huge axe again, which glinted in the light of the dim sunset as a symbol of impending doom. This blow was to be the decisive one. The beast stood directly in front of Null, towering over him like a giant shadow ready to crush everything in its path. Null realized that this strike would be 10 times stronger than the previous ones. The monster had put all its fury into it. He had a choice: dodge and save his life, or try to meet the attack and save the girl who stood behind him, paralyzed with terror. Clenching the hilt of his sword so tightly that his fingers turned white, Null prepared for the final blow. As the axe came down, the world seemed to stand still. The force of the collision was so tremendous that the air around him literally rumbled with tension, as if the wind itself was afraid to come near the place. The sound of the impact was deafening, as if the very ground itself shook beneath his feet. But something went wrong. Instead of chopping Null's sword, the monster's axe suddenly slipped from his grasp. In an instant that seemed like an eternity, everything stopped. Even Buffalo, blinded by rage, froze for a moment, not realizing what had just happened. His eyes, hitherto filled with cruelty and hatred, suddenly widened in utter bewilderment. He could not understand how this weak-looking man, whom he was about to destroy, had managed to knock his weapon out of his hands. The axe, slowly rotating in the air as if by the law of its own gravity, headed downward. The motion seemed endless, as if time had decided to slow its run, letting Buffalo realize his inevitable fate. The blade of the axe, glinting in the last rays of the sun like a harbinger of death, plunged into the chest of its owner with stunning precision. The monster collapsed to the ground with such a rumble that it seemed as if the earth itself shook. The huge, invincible monster that had just represented something unimaginably powerful was now bleeding. Blood gushed from the wound, filling the ground around it, and the monster's life slowly faded away like a flame left without wood. Null, seeing the monster that had seemed invulnerable to him fall before him, felt a strange sense of emptiness. He had won, but it brought him neither joy nor a sense of triumph. Rather, it was a feeling of inner emptiness, as if his entire soul had been drained by this battle. Null slowly sank to the ground, his knees buckled, and he sat amidst the destruction, feeling the last breath leaving him. His body trembled with exertion, and his heart pounded so loudly that he could barely hear his own thoughts. His hands, still gripping the hilt of his sword, were trembling, and his muscles ached as if they were about to tear. He was at the limit of his strength, and consciousness was slowly beginning to leave him. Null always believed that his dedication to training was second to none. He believed that by honing his skills daily, he was growing stronger, and that his hard work, even if it did not bear quick fruit, would eventually lead him to his goal. However, he suddenly realized that despite all the years he had spent in training, he was not prepared enough for the real test. The buffalo had shown him how weak he still was, how far from being a true adventurer. He still felt unprepared to go on a great journey, to become the hero he dreamed of being. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted. Null felt a light touch on his shoulder. He turned around and saw the girl he had saved from the monster. She slowly approached him, her eyes full of gratitude and relief, as if she had just realized that her life had not been cut short in those terrible moments when the buffalo was ready to crush her with his axe. The girl turned back to the battlefield, where the bodies of the fallen soldiers still lay, her face contorted with grief as she screamed, tearing her voice, trying to see if there were any survivors. Her scream echoed through the silent, deserted street, as if summoning the ghosts of those who had fallen in the bloody battle. Two soldiers slowly approached the girl, their footsteps heavy and their faces covered with the marks of battle. Their bodies were scratched, their armor cracked, and their facial expressions spoke of the ordeal they had endured. They quietly asked the girl if she had been injured in this terrible battle. Despite her fatigue and shock, she shook her head negatively. She was not physically wounded, but her heart was broken at the loss of those who had given their lives to save her. Her voice trembled as she said that she was all right, thanks to the man who had saved her. She wanted to point at Nola so that the soldiers could express their gratitude to him as well, but when she turned around, he wasn't there. The girl froze, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw that the spot where Null had just stood was now empty. The soldiers, noticing her confusion, began to look around as well, but there was only silence and emptiness all around. They all looked at the place where Null had just been, but did not realize where he might have disappeared to. Meanwhile, Null was already far away. He was gone, unwilling to accept either gratitude or glory for his deed. Looking up at the stars that twinkled in the night sky, Null realized that far greater challenges lay ahead. He knew he had to become stronger. This experience was not enough to deal with the real threats that awaited the adventurer at every turn. There was hard work ahead of him, even more grueling training, and challenges that would only get more difficult. The morning found the garrison in an unusual state. The soldiers, usually absorbed in the routine of morning training and duties, were gathered in one place, animatedly discussing the events of the previous day. The sudden appearance of the Minotaur at the main entrance to the city had come as a shock to everyone, and it was impossible to ignore the fact. The testimony of Miss Reinbrick, an eyewitness and participant in the fight, left no doubt as to the seriousness of the situation. She described the battle and how the corpse of the Minotaur with the marks of the holy sword was found after the battle. But what raised even more questions was that the autopsy of the monster showed not its usual origin, but magical intervention. It turned out that the Minotaur was not just a beast from ancient myths, but the result of summoning magic, which only complicated the picture of what was going on. One of the warriors standing in the circle of his comrades continued his explanation, pointing out that all the evidence pointed to the fact that this attack was organized by humans. It was not a random release of magic or a mistake of natural forces. In his hands was an old, worn artifact, a ring found among the remains of a Minotaur. He explained that the magical traces left on the ring and at the site of the battle indicated that the action might have been orchestrated by one of the Empire's mages. The warriors knew that comparing the artifact to other magical items from the archives gave a clear indication. This artifact was no ordinary item. Most likely, the ring was created by a holy mage, one of the most powerful mages, which made the situation critical. The warriors discussed that its creation and use for dark purposes could mean the beginning of something more than just an attack on the city. The thought surfaced in the conversation that this attack was not a single act of aggression. Perhaps it was an attempt to destroy the force field that guarded the queen and break into the heart of the kingdom. That would explain why the princess was threatened. The warriors were seriously contemplating that this could have been part of a vast conspiracy involving forces that wanted to overthrow the royalty. However, it was illogical to leave such obvious traces, and the soldiers were puzzled. Why would such experienced opponents make such an oversight? Another warrior standing opposite supported the view that the purpose of these conspirators was not related to Lady Reinbrick. She could only have been an accidental victim in a much larger plan. There were probably forces behind the attack that sought to bring about a war between the two nations. It was a game on the brink of destruction, and its target could have been the country's valuable resources, the relics of the endless labyrinth kept under the protection of the kingdom. These artifacts were a coveted trophy for anyone who knew of their immense magical power. Reading the next papers, another soldier expressed his surprise regarding Ms. Reinbrick's mysterious savior. The report said that the Minotaur was struck with an ordinary sword, but this sword was somehow able to surpass the power of the holy sword. The man continued, adding that they had been trying to track down this unknown hero, but all their efforts had yielded no results. This person had disappeared as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace. The guy asked with annoyance why there was still not a single clue, not a single hint that would help move the investigation forward. He could hear the frustration in his voice. After all, he was facing elite Royal Scouts who had been trained in the art of trackers and should have no trouble finding any trace. He demanded an explanation with clenched fists, realizing that every missed detail could be a clue. The scouts, who were used to such questions, lowered their gazes, realizing that they were truly powerless in this situation. However, after a moment, the guy took a deep breath and began to realize that if this mysterious person acted alone and was skilled enough to leave no trace behind him, then searching for him might be a waste of time and resources. This realization made him change his mind. He gave the order to stop searching and forget about this incident as something that could not be resolved. However, despite his decision, he couldn't completely let go of the matter. An inner restlessness kept him on his toes. Guy ordered his men to speed up the investigation of other details and not to lose a second, for time was playing against them, and any hiccup could lead to disastrous consequences. The next morning, Null came to the guild as usual, not expecting anything special. The guildmaster, an elderly man who was always on the lookout, met him with a serious expression. He immediately told Null what had happened, a strange monster that had appeared near where Null was working on the construction site. Null was surprised by this news. He remembered the rumbling sound from the night before, but he didn't pay much attention to it. The guildmaster, seeing his bewilderment, explained that it had all happened in a labyrinth near the construction site. The man, noticing Null's confusion, told him that the people in the town were excited about the appearance of the monster, and many didn't understand how such a creature could appear so close to the town. Null, trying to recall the events of the previous night, suddenly realized that it was probably about the very same buffalo he had fought. This moment became pivotal for him, for the whole picture now formed in his mind. The guildmaster, as the conversation continued, noted that Null was incredibly lucky. He explained that a single Minotaur could easily defeat a whole group of experienced adventurers at the peak of their abilities, the so-called S-class adventurers. But the rumors that circulated among the people said that the mysterious stranger who managed to defeat the monster must have possessed incredible strength. Null, while continuing to listen to the guildmaster, couldn't resist commenting that that stranger who had single-handedly defeated the Minotaur must have incredible strength and agility. The man opposite nodded gravely, confirming Null's thoughts, and added that if it had not been for this mysterious hero, the city would long ago have been in ruins. He spoke with sincere gratitude and admiration in his voice, as if he himself had witnessed those events. These words sounded strange to Nola. He knew that his actions had saved many, but he had never imagined that he would be spoken of with such honor. The guildmaster then handed Nola a pouch of coins for the last task he had completed. Inside the pouch were coins jingling with a pleasant heaviness. Although it was just a routine task for Null, the host noticed that he had done a great job and expressed his satisfaction. Null smiled, accepting the gratitude. He knew he wasn't working as an adventurer for material rewards. However, their conversation was interrupted when a girl hidden under a deep hood entered the guild. Her quiet entrance went unnoticed by either Nola or the guild master, who were immersed in their conversation. They continued talking, not even realizing that someone new had entered the room. The guildmaster, as if oblivious to his surroundings, began to convince Null again that it was time for him to consider a more prestigious and lucrative job. He believed that Null had long outgrown his role as a mere adventurer. The man recalled telling him more than once that in a normal job he could earn several times more than he did now. Null nodded, acknowledging that he had known that for a long time. But he had never sought riches, and so he continued to work in the guild while completing tasks. Despite this, the master did not relent. He added that it was time for Null to look for a job that would not only bring in more money, but also provide more opportunities for self-fulfillment. The landlord realized that Nola's potential was far beyond what he was currently using and sincerely wanted to help him. Suddenly, the girl who was standing in the penumbra spoke. Slowly removing the hood that hid her face, she looked at Nola carefully and uttered that she had finally found him. Her words gave Nola an unexpected feeling, and he, along with the guild master, looked at the girl in surprise. For a moment, silence hung in the air, and suddenly a memory surfaced in Nola's mind. This girl was the very one he had saved from the Minotaur. His eyes reflected recognition, and he felt the memories of that battle flash back into his mind. The girl, noticing that Null recognized her, nodded slightly, acknowledging his reaction. She seemed to feel some relief from this moment as well. After a brief pause, she added that she realized she was acting perhaps a little brash, but it was important for her to find him to thank him in person. Null, still surprised by her appearance, asked a quite logical question: how she was able to find him, since after that event it seemed to him that someone was watching him, but he was sure that he was able to hide from everyone. The girl calmly explained that she had used magic, specifically the remote detection skill that allows you to track people over long distances. This caused Nola to be even more surprised. He couldn't help but admire her abilities and immediately asked if she was a hunter, assuming that such skills could belong to someone from that class. However, the girl frankly explained that her abilities belonged to the magic school, though she had skills from other classes as well. She admitted that she wasn't that good at most of them, but knew enough due to the fact that they were inherited in her family. It didn't seem like anything particularly outstanding to her, though to Nola her versatility was a real revelation. Despite her young age, she already knew so many skills that Null had to admit to himself that he had underestimated her. After taking a quick glance around the guild room, the girl noticed that there were too many people inside for a quiet conversation. She suggested that Nola go outside, where they could continue their conversation in a more private setting. At that moment, the guild master, with his usual curiosity, leaned over to Null and quietly asked where he had found such an attractive companion. Null, feeling slightly embarrassed, quickly whispered back that he had never flirted with anyone and that it was just a chance encounter. The girl looked back at Nola and with a slight smile on her face confidently stated that they had nothing to worry about prying eyes and ears as long as they walked. Her voice sounded calm but firm as she added that thanks to the soundproofing and cloaking spells she had cast, no one would be able to overhear their conversation or notice their movements. Null nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure of the magic, but her calmness was transmitted to him as well. At the same time, the guild master, clearly caring for Null, reminded him to stay out of trouble and return in one piece. Null, with a slight smile, nodded again, expressing his gratitude for his concern. Once they were outside, the air seemed fresh and cool, a light breeze ruffling their hair. The girl stepping beside Null suddenly stopped for a moment, apologizing for her impertinence. Her eyes softened for a moment, and she admitted that she had come to him for a specific purpose that she could not ignore. She explained quietly but confidently that she had come to express her gratitude for him saving her life. Her gaze was filled with genuine gratitude that seemed to overflow into her words as she reiterated that if it weren't for Null, not only would she not have survived, but the entire city might have been in danger. Null, for his part, embarrassedly stated that his actions were nothing special. To him, it was part of an adventurer's duty to protect those in need of help. But the girl wasn't going to give up on that. She blurted out with sudden passion that she was speaking in sincerity, for if he hadn't been around, she wouldn't be standing here talking to him right now. Her words sounded like sharp truth, and her gaze burned with determination. She added that her family had prepared many awards to somehow express their recognition of his exploit, and suggested that Nola ask for anything. Her voice was full of insistence, and she added that their family could provide Null with anything, be it money, resources, or rare artifacts, for there was nothing for her family that they could not acquire. Null stood, clearly surprised by such an offer. He had not been prepared for such gestures of generosity. A faint smile flashed across his face as he thanked the girl for her offer, but he modestly declined, believing he did not deserve such honors. But the girl was not going to give up so easily. She reiterated once again that he should not be shy and that he could ask for whatever his heart desired. Moreover, she emphasized that her father and older brother were eager to meet Null in person to thank him. Null again refused, saying that it was enough that she had come and expressed her gratitude. He accepted her words and was glad he could help. But the girl seemed upset by this response. She exclaimed sharply that it was not enough. For her and her family to leave such a savior without proper reward was unthinkable. Her voice shook with excitement and desperation, as if she was willing to fight for the chance to thank Nola. She declared that it just couldn't be done that way. You couldn't leave him without proper recompense. Null, despite his modesty, was touched by her eagerness. He tried to reassure the girl, assuring her that he really didn't need anything. The girl, having gathered her thoughts, suddenly spoke with anxiety in her voice, not hiding her excitement, and asked Null the question that had troubled her from the beginning. She gently but insistently asked if he had any difficulties or problems she could help with. Null, as always, remained cool and confident. He looked at her with a slight smile, but there was firmness in his voice when he declared that her help was unnecessary. The girl thoughtfully offered more weighty assistance, saying that if Nola did have serious problems, her father could go directly to the major or even to higher officials to settle any difficulty. It was an offer that was hard to refuse. After all, her family had a lot of influence, and such help could solve a lot of issues. However, Null interrupted her again, but this time his voice was a little harsher, lacking the softness of before. He made it clear that he didn't need anything, and while her suggestions sounded sincere, it wasn't the kind of help he wanted to use. His refusal was so resolute that the girl couldn't help but feel her insistence shattering against the wall of his calm unapproachability. Her shoulders slumped slightly and she lowered her head, admitting defeat. A slight shadow of disappointment appeared on her face, for she really wanted to help, but she realized that her attempts were pointless. Null, seeing the girl's embarrassment and loss of hope, softened. He apologized for his harshness and tried to explain that his actions didn't need to be rewarded. He really did not want anything in return, and his help was sincere, with no hidden intention of getting something in return. However, instead of relief, tears appeared in the girl's eyes. She sobbed and faintly declared that this would not be the case. It was imperative for her to thank Nola. She could not leave this debt unpaid. Her voice trembled, and at this point she looked completely lost. Null, seeing her tears, was even more confused. He didn't know what the right thing to do was, because his refusals seemed to cause her more pain. But before he could say anything, the girl cried out sharply, asking him to accept her gratitude. There was a real plea in her voice, almost a desperation that touched Nola's soul. She warned that if he continued to refuse, she simply would not be able to hold back her tears and would cry right there in the middle of the street. Her determined yet trembling gaze was fixed on Nola, and he sighed heavily and realized that there was simply no point in resisting any longer. He couldn't let her suffer because of his stubbornness. After much internal deliberation, Null finally agreed. He offered to go and meet her family, realizing that it would probably soothe her heart. The girl, genuinely amazed and delighted that Null had agreed to her proposal to meet her family, could not hide her delight. She questioned him with slight excitement as to whether he was joking and whether he had really agreed. Null, however, remained, as always, composed and calm. With his usual poise, he asked her not to get too carried away by her emotions and to keep a sober mind. The girl, not wishing to waste any time, proposed to set out right away. She immediately added that she would cast spells of stealth and resistance to detection on them, so that their journey would go unnoticed, and they would avoid unnecessary attention from passers-by and guards. Their journey began surrounded by a light spell haze, and soon they came to wide staircases stretching upwards towards the clouds. The staircases were monumental and grand, their stone steps going upward as a symbol of infinite power and might. The girl, full of confidence, walked forward with light and confident steps, as if she knew each step by heart. Null followed her, feeling his respect for her family and this place grow as they ascended. At one point, the girl pointed forward with a slight smile, and a majestic picture appeared before Null. A huge ancient castle that seemed to be part of another world, a world of ancient legends and tales. Null stopped for a moment, amazed by the size and grandeur of the structure. It was not just a large building, it was a true symbol of the power and wealth that had been preserved in this family for centuries. Null could not contain his surprise and asked the girl if this was really her house. She nodded with a slight smile and a note of modesty, confirming his guess. There was an unexpected modesty in her voice as she added that perhaps the castle was not as magnificent as it might appear from the outside. They continued along the stone paths leading to the entrance when the girl suddenly stopped, realizing that they still hadn't exchanged names. She was slightly embarrassed, and her face flushed with a slight blush. With a smile, she turned to Null and asked his name softly. Null answered her question by introducing himself and only then realized that he didn't know her name himself yet. He asked her the same question with mild curiosity. The girl, feeling a sudden rush of embarrassment, froze for a moment, as if considering how best to continue the conversation. Her eyes, which had previously sparkled with joy, suddenly sank to the floor, and she quietly, with an apologetic tone, admitted that she had forgotten to introduce herself. This moment betrayed her excitement and slight confusion. She introduced herself by her full name, Rinbrick Cries, but immediately added with a soft smile that she could be called simply Rin, as her family and close friends do. For Nola, the name was no longer just a formality. It had become something personal, something meaningful, something that connected him to Rin not only on the level of words, but also through the emotion she put into that short performance. Nodding in acknowledgement of her words, Null thought for a moment. They continued through the castle, and the deeper they went, the more impressive the place became. The corridors they walked through were vast and decorated with magnificent detail. Huge halls, their walls hung with ancient tapestries, conveyed the spirit of the time and heritage that was part of this family's history. Each turn of the corridor revealed new halls, each one seeming more imposing than the last. And this only reinforced the feeling that the Ryan family was influential and wielded great power. Suddenly, after a long passage through the corridors, they came to a girl whose presence instantly filled the atmosphere with importance. It was Ains, a figure who clearly held a special position in the castle. Rin hurried toward her with such eagerness as if she had met an old friend. Ains, a person of obviously significant position in this place, immediately showed her respect by greeting Rin as Master Rinbrick. There was a deep reverence in this address that made it clear to Null that Rin's status here was much higher than he could have imagined. Rin, full of emotion and excitement, could not contain her desire to see her father, who was not just the head of the family, but an important figure in her life. However, despite her enthusiasm, Ains informed her with some caution that it would not be possible to meet His Majesty, her father, at the moment. He was busy in a meeting, which cooled Rin's impulse somewhat, but did not extinguish her joy. When Ains turned her attention to Nola, her gaze changed. There was a slight perplexity in her eyes, mixed with professional wariness. To her, he was a stranger within the castle walls, where every person and every event was under scrutiny. Rin hastened to explain the situation for Null. To her, Null was not just a companion, but a savior, a man who had risked his life for her. She made it clear that Null deserved not just attention, but respect. It was a way for her to thank him, for in her words came all the deep recognition of his heroism that she had felt since the day he had saved her. Ains, taking Rin's words to heart, still remained cautious. Her movements were crisp and restrained, and she offered to escort them further into the castle. Ains led them down a long corridor that gradually widened and became more majestic. As they approached the massive hall doors, Ains paused, casting a shrewd glance at Nola and Rin. She seemed to assess Null once more before motioning for them to step inside. Null couldn't help but notice this caution in her movements and mannerisms. He could see that Ains was used to everything about the palace, whether it was meeting with important guests or making unexpected visits. But despite her professionalism, her wariness towards him was evident. And there was a deep meaning to it. The appearance of an unknown person in such places was always perceived as a potential threat, as a possible disturbance of peace and order. As they stepped into the long corridor leading to the main hall, a tall young man with clear eyes and an open, confident posture stood before them. It was Gilbat, and a slight smile lit up his face as he saw Ains, Master Reinbrick, and the stranger accompanying her heading toward him. Assessing the situation and realizing that now was not the time to ask questions, Gilbat bowed slightly, giving way to them, and continued to watch them approach. However, Ains reminded him of his courtesy with a subtle note of sternness, emphasizing that he was a special guest of Master Reinbrick, and that he was expected to be respectful. Gilbat, though he accepted her words with a slight humility, could not refrain from remarking, as he passed Nola, with a slight chuckle, that rumors of the unusual visitor seemed to be already circulating in the castle. Gilbat stepped aside, but his gaze lingered on his sister's shoulders, where his own invisibility cloak rested. The expression on his face changed instantly, and he raised his eyebrows and raised his voice to express his indignation. Gilbat couldn't contain his surprise and asked his sister why she had taken such a valuable item without his permission. The invisibility cloak was not just a rare artifact, but something of great importance in their family and required careful handling. Rin, visibly embarrassed, lowered her eyes and barely audibly uttered an apology, acknowledging her oversight. Her voice was quiet, but there was a firm intention to defend her decision. She really wanted to find her savior, and thought the opportunity was worth breaking the rules. There was sincerity and determination on her face, and although Gilbat still could not hide his surprise, he understood the meaning of her action. In that moment, he realized that this man was her savior. Rin confirmed his hunch, explaining that Null was the one who had risked his life for her on that ill-fated day. As they approached the massive doors leading into the hall, Rin and her companions found themselves facing the head of the family. Her father, the man, though not young, looked majestic. His posture and calm, confident gaze gave him away as an experienced and wise man. When he saw Nola, a shadow of gratitude and respect lit up his face, for before him stood the man who had saved his daughter from mortal danger. He held his gaze on Null and squinted, noting to himself that Null looked much younger than he had expected when he heard of his exploit. Rising from his seat, he took a few steps forward and gestured for Null to come closer for a more personal conversation. Null, sensing that he was facing not just a nobleman but a loving father, responded with restraint and respect, adding that it did not matter to him whether the nobleman before him was a nobleman or someone else. Still, realizing that his words might sound too harsh, Null wondered with slight embarrassment if he seemed overly bold. The man smiled, and his warm gaze injected a note of confidence into the conversation. He assured Nola that straightforwardness was not something to be ashamed of. Moreover, he said, it only made their conversation easier, stripping it of the formality of aristocrats. When Father Rain extended his hand to Nola, his gesture was full of sincere gratitude. In that shake was all his appreciation for the fact that this man, despite his youth, had shown true courage and saved his daughter. He tried to put his respect and gratitude into words, but quickly realized that no words could convey how deep his appreciation was. And, in spite of this, he declared that he must properly thank Nola as befitted such occasions. Null, with his characteristic modesty and sincerity, gazed into Father Rin's eyes and, with restraint and calmness, said that he did not need anything material. He said that a word of gratitude was more than enough for him and that the very act for which they had gathered did not require repayment. Father Rain, however, realized that he could not simply let go of his daughter's savior. He approached Null with seriousness and almost insistence, offering to name any reward he wished. Father Rain not only offered him gold, land, or other riches, but allowed him to choose something that could symbolize the depth of their gratitude. With these words, it was as if he were revealing to Null all the riches he possessed, making it clear that for the sake of his daughter's savior he was ready to grant his every wish. Null, feeling that he was facing a serious test of his principles, looked at Father Rain with a soft smile and calmly replied that he needed nothing but words of gratitude from his heart. Those words meant more to him than anything else. They reminded him of his own aspirations, that it was more important for him to become strong, to develop his skills and experience, to one day reach the level of a true master adventurer. He knew that riches and gold were useless for such a path. He was just an E-rank adventurer whose path to success was through long and hard work, through battles and experience that money could not buy. Realizing this, he felt that any material rewards would be empty to him. Father Rain, watching Nola's face closely, caught in his eyes not a desire for material things, but a sincere desire for growth and personal accomplishment. With a slight smile, he offered Nola an alternative, something truly rare and precious, something that could help him achieve his goals. He pointed to the ancient treasures hidden in the labyrinth and said that among them Null could choose any of them. For these items were priceless things. They could not be bought with any money, but perhaps among them he would find something that would be of use to him. Gilbert, who had been standing behind his father all this time, shook his head demurely, showing slight displeasure. He could not restrain the remark that there was no need to offer such rare and important things to a stranger. Null pondered the suggestion, however, and turning his thoughts back to the memory of the day he had met the Minotaur. The thought crept into his heart that perhaps Rin could have handled the situation herself if she hadn't given into panic and used her own skills. Null felt that perhaps he had played an unnecessary role, intervening in a situation that the girl could have resolved on her own. That realization made him feel that the family's gratitude was excessive to him, and he found himself thinking again that he didn't need anything. Father Ryan, noticing Nola's hesitation, looked at him gently, realizing that the young man couldn't choose not because he didn't want to, but because he felt uncomfortable with the situation. Then he asked Nola a direct question, whether he really didn't need anything, or if he just couldn't choose because he didn't know what he needed. The man sensed that Null needed a little guidance in this choice, and with a warm smile assured him that he would find something suitable if Null himself was undecided. He decided to choose for Null an ancient and trusted sword, a unique treasure to aid him in his pursuit of mastery. The man walked leisurely to a massive wall studded with relics and ancient artifacts testifying to his family's great heritage. With a slight movement of his hand, he touched the hilt of a black sword, which immediately caught Null's attention with its imposing aura and mysterious power. The metal of the sword seemed to absorb the shadows of the past, absorbing all the light around it and making it seem as if it carried through the centuries a history of glorious battles and unsolved mysteries. The man carefully removed the sword from its mount, turned to Null, and, raising it in front of him, assessed with a glance how the weapon would look in the hands of the young adventurer. Null froze, delighted and stunned by what he saw. It wasn't just a sword, it was a symbol of strength, power, and the past, and its deep, light-absorbing black hue made it even more mystical. Null, a little confused, asked almost reverently if it was really a weapon or just a majestic symbol. The man, noticing Null's confusion, nodded approvingly, and then with a soft smile with a hint of irony noted that the sword itself was a little worn and lost its luster, but that only added to its charm. Nearby, Gilbat, concerned about his father's intention to gift such a powerful weapon, cautiously tried to intervene. He expressed doubt that such an artifact was appropriate for Null, for this weapon held deep significance for the family. His father, however, calmly explained that the sword had long served only as an ornament, and if it were replaced with a replica, no one would even notice the switch. Gilbat wanted to object, but seeing his father's determination, only sighed, realizing that his words were unlikely to change anything. The man, realizing that the excitement of the children could break the seriousness of the moment, asked them in a soft but insistent tone to be quiet. Rin and Gilbat exchanged quick glances, and their faces reflected the realization that any objections now would be misplaced. When Null held out his hand to accept the sword, his movements were careful and almost reverent, as if he were touching an ancient relic containing the secrets of bygone times. He examined the weapon for a few seconds, feeling a slight chill emanating from the hilt, penetrating his fingers. Looking up, Null said that, judging by the esteem in which this object was held, it carried great importance and the weight of responsibility. To accept such a gift was not easy for him, and he expressed with doubt in his voice that perhaps he should not do so. With a smile on his lips, Father Rin looked at Null and calmly explained that the sword had once been acquired on one of his long-distance expeditions, but had never once brought him any use or joy over the years. The man thought that such a weapon should find a new owner, for whom it could become a source of strength. After a short thought, Null nodded and, thanking the man, agreed to accept the sword. The man nodded approvingly and invited Null to test the sword to feel its weight and power in action. As Null held the sword out in front of him, he immediately felt the powerful and heavy blade slightly filed downward, demanding a firm grip and stability. This sword was as if it were alive. It infused Null with some unknown power, and the sensation sent a shiver down his spine. Feeling the weight and energy of the blade, he swung the sword with confidence, his smile growing wider and sparks of joy in his eyes. He felt the sword become an extension of himself with each movement, as if they were connected by one invisible thread. The sword was heavy, but Null, thanks to his inner strength and determination, handled it easily, feeling that now with this weapon in his hands he could control almost anything. The man who watched Null closely noted with slight admiration how skillfully he handled the sword with one hand. Despite the visible signs of time and wear and tear on the blade, the sword remained strong, as if it held not only the metal but also the spirit of former battles. The man, as if thinking aloud, told Null the story of how the sword had saved his life in critical moments, emphasizing that it was such trials that made the weapon truly valuable and irreplaceable. Null pledged with sincere reverence to handle the gift with care, feeling that for him it was becoming not just a weapon but something meaningful and personal. At this point, the man shifted his gaze to his daughter, Rhine, and after a brief thought, offered Nola to be her bodyguard for a time. He explained that recent events had made him uneasy, and he would like to see someone he could trust with his daughter's safety. Null, maintaining a respectful tone, apologized but politely declined, explaining that he believed in Ryan's strength and abilities, and that she herself should face challenges to gain independence. The man, a little surprised by this response, nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Nola's words and respecting his decision. Null, glancing once more at his new sword, felt grateful to fate. He hated to think that he would leave here empty-handed, and this weapon, shrouded in a mysterious halo of power and strength, seemed to him a real find. Running his fingers over the massive hilt, he noticed a small but curious detail, a slightly prominent protrusion, as if designed to provide additional support. Smiling at his unexpected thought, Null imagined how this sword might come in handy for repairing the gutter at Aunt Stella's place, as if designed to fit the width of the blade. The thought struck him as amusing, and he decided to test his theory the next day. With these thoughts, Null headed for the exit, feeling light and happy about the gift he had received. But as he took a few steps, he heard Anne's confident voice behind him, asking him to stay a moment. Null turned around, noticing the determined look on her face. She stepped closer, her eyes expressing seriousness and respect. As she approached him, Anne suddenly dropped to one knee, a movement that startled Null, so unexpected was it. Respect shone in her eyes and she began to apologize for her behavior, admitting that she was unaware of what he had done and that he was Miss Reinbrick's savior. Her words were quiet but imbued with genuine regret, and she repeated her apology for acting inappropriately. Null replied with a slight smile that he held no grudge against her, understanding perfectly well why she might have shown displeasure. He realized that it was her duty to be the loyal guardian and protector of the Craze family, and that required her to pay the utmost attention to everyone who crossed the threshold of their home. He asked her to get up, thinking her apology was enough and he didn't want her kneeling in front of him. Ainz, with a serious and focused look, emphasized that it was her duty to protect the Cry's family, and that is why she was always vigilant for every guest who crossed the threshold of their home. Ainz added that she sincerely appreciated Null's generosity, but the responsibility for the safety of her masters so close to her heart was more important. Null, catching the serious tone of her words, nodded in appreciation of her sincerity. He added with a slight smile that it might be a little difficult to be under such strain all the time, especially in a home environment where every new person seemed a potential threat. Throwing a brief glance at Ainz, he asked with interest if she was a maid. At first glance, this might have seemed like an innocent and mundane question, but it unexpectedly elicited a reaction from Ainz that was not quite usual for such a conversation. Instead of taking offense at his assumption, Ainz smiled faintly, and her eyes sparkled with hidden pleasure. With a slight bow full of respect, she asked permission to introduce herself formally. There was pride in her voice as she voiced her full name, Ainz Hands, emphasizing that she held the significant position of deputy commander of a military corps reporting solely to the Cry's family. However, even more important to her was her title, God's Shield, symbolizing her willingness to be a reliable barrier to all enemies, standing between her masters and any danger like an unshakable shield ready to meet a blow at any moment. With a note of regret, Ainz went on and confessed that she had been temporarily relieved of her duties for special reasons on that fateful day when Miss Rin was attacked by the Minotaur. At this point her voice faltered for a moment, regret evident in it as she realized that the absence could have led to tragedy. She confessed that it troubled her heart that her mistress was left unprotected at such a crucial time. Had it not been for Null, Rin might have been in mortal danger, and Ainz herself would have risked severe punishment for dereliction of her duty. There was genuine gratitude in her words, and with a slight inclination of her head she thanked Null for saving not only Rhine, but also for saving her from the shame that might otherwise have robbed her of both honor and life. Her voice sounded heartfelt and sincere as she assured Null that he could always count on her help in times of need. Null sensed a real respect and sincerity in her words that touched him. He noted with a slight smile that her support could indeed be helpful if he were to face difficulties. Respect flashed in her gaze, but something else immediately appeared: wariness, as if deep inside she was reserving a share of distrust. Ainz, with a slight tension in her gaze and seriousness in her voice, tried to make her point as directly as possible. She explained to Nola that despite his good intentions, high merit, and actions that had saved her mistress's life, she could not fully trust him. Her devotion to duty and absolute affection for her lordship were so strong that she could not simply forget his frankness before the king, and the ease with which he conversed with Miss Rhine, at times even overly casual. She warned Nola frankly that today's incident was an exception, but that she would not be able to forgive such behavior in the future. It sounded like a kind of boundary she had drawn around her trust in him, hoping he would understand her position and be able to show more respect and restraint in the future. Null, deeply appreciating her honesty and seriousness, nodded, accepting her words with respect. He thanked her for her forthrightness and candor, fully understanding the importance of those beliefs to her. In that simple gesture was his recognition of her importance, and he accepted her words as something to be considered. Then Ainz, at one point softening and showing a subtle warmth, asked him for his name, explaining that she would like to know how to address her savior. When Null said his name, her eyes opened wide with surprise. As if stunned, she froze for a moment, staring at him intently, as if some internal process filled with realization and confusion was taking place in her mind. After a moment, as if returning to her normal state, she turned away, apologized briefly, and said she had to leave. Null, noticing her strange reaction, wondered with slight concern if everything was all right. But Ainz only nodded briefly, and without further explanation, hurried away, leaving him slightly confused. As he looked at her, Null remained thoughtful for a moment. Her unexpected reaction made him both interested and perplexed, but deciding not to pay too much attention to it, he headed for the exit, mentally concluding his stay here. Halfway there, however, he was suddenly stopped by a bright glare flashing directly in front of his face. A sense of danger made him instantly tense up, and he involuntarily reached for the hilt of his new sword. Looking up, he found Gilbat standing before him with a slight smile on his lips and holding his weapon in a confident pose that had something friendly but with a touch of defiance. Gilbat, making no secret of his joy, looked at Null with a sly fire in his eyes, evidently intending to keep him a little longer. With undisguised amusement he asked if Null was going to leave too soon, as if he hoped for their further communication. There was a challenge in his gaze, a hint that their conversation might turn into something more interesting than a mere exchange of pleasantries. Gilbat stared at Null, his gaze piercing and heavy, as if he wanted to see the depths of the young adventurer's soul. Finally, in a calm and confident manner, he proposed that Null fight. Null, who had not expected such an offer, frowned slightly, his eyebrows raised in surprise, and he looked at Gilbat carefully, as if trying to grasp his true intentions. Questions swarmed in his mind, but his voice remained calm as he asked why on earth Gilbat wanted to fight him. But despite the initial bewilderment, barely a few minutes had passed when the two warriors were already standing opposite each other on the training ground. They were surrounded by the tense and curious gazes of spectators waiting for the real spectacle. Their bodies were ready to fight, and there was a tension in the air that seemed to attract everyone around them. With nonchalant confidence, Gilbat walked to the wall of the hall where the weapons meant for training were neatly arranged. His hand rested confidently on the hilt of a long spear hanging from a bracket. Then he took the sword in his other hand, gripping the hilt tightly as if to show his readiness for any turn of events. His gaze turned to Null, and with icy calmness he informed him that the latter had already become a well-known personality in the capital. There was a hidden challenge in Gilbat's voice, as if he was provoking Null to unleash his potential. Then, tossing up his sword, he offered Null to take it, making it clear that he was willing to test the rumors and see if Null was really worth the fame that surrounded him. The sword flew into the air and landed with a quiet rustle right in front of Null, as if inviting him to accept the challenge not with words but with actions. Without hesitation, Null took a step forward and gripped the hilt of the sword tightly, never taking his eyes off Gilbat. He calmly and confidently stated that he was looking forward to this duel, and there was not an ounce of doubt in his words. His whole look spoke of determination and willingness to test himself. Gilbat nodded slightly, approving of Nola's determination, and, in a barely audible tone, motioned for the fight to begin. A moment later, without giving Null time to think, Gilbat rushed forward. His spear, as if an extension of his will, cut through the air, hurtling toward Null with frightening speed and precision. But Null, showing extraordinary agility, easily dodged the blow, leaving Gilbat somewhat disappointed. However, Gilbat did not give up. He attacked again and again, his spear getting faster each time, making more and more dangerous arcs. But each of his blows, which seemed deadly, failed to reach its target. Null slipped away like a shadow, anticipating Gilbat's every move with precision. Gilbat lunged again, but with every step and every swing of his spear he realized that Null was easily evading his blows. He decided to increase his speed, and clutching the spear tighter, as if merging with it into one, began to attack faster and harder, testing whether Null could continue to dodge. Gilbat, in an attempt to arouse at least a bit of the true hero in Null, challenged him, loudly declaring that if he was the hero they say he is, let him show him what he can do and lecture him properly. In the midst of the battle, as his body was already operating at the limits of its capabilities, memories of another battle, long past but forever etched in his mind, surfaced in Gilbat's mind. It was the day he first realized that he had the power to change the world around him. He remembered standing in the middle of the battlefield, surrounded by a crowd of spectators who whispered excitedly about him as if he were a legend, a warrior, whose strength was invincible and no one could resist his power. It was then that Gilbat felt for the first time that he was not just a fighter, but the chosen one, the bearer of a unique talent for spear fighting, destined to stand out among the rest. These thoughts became the fuel that fueled his determination in the years that followed. Gilbat began to train with even greater dedication, devoting himself fully to the art of combat. He loved to feel his strength growing, how each new day made him more and more invincible. One day, Gilbat was standing in the open air, breathing in the freshness of the morning wind. It was at that moment that he was approached by an unfamiliar man who appeared like a shadow. His figure was covered by a long cloak and his face was partially hidden by a hood, which gave him a mysterious appearance. The man approached slowly and looked at Gilbat with a scrutinizing gaze, asking if he felt any dissatisfaction. The question sounded direct and unexpected, like an arrow hitting its target. Gilbat frowned slightly, pondering the answer, and then honestly admitted that he had been bored lately. The man, hearing his answer, nodded as if confirming his own thoughts, and asked another question, whether Gilbat was looking for a challenge. There was a subtle hint in his voice, as if he knew something that Gilbat did not yet realize. The stranger added that, unfortunately, there was hardly anyone here in these parts who could challenge him. Gilbat proudly declared that he had already defeated all worthy opponents in the capital, and believed that he could only find someone worthy outside of it. He told how he had gradually stopped training with the local teachers, as they could no longer offer him anything new, and that all he wanted now was a strong partner equal to him in strength and skill. He needed someone who shared his desire for excellence and was willing to fight as an equal. The man listened to him carefully, as if weighing each word, and then said thoughtfully that perhaps Gilbat would soon meet someone who could satisfy his thirst for a true challenge. He explained that conflict with other countries was just around the corner, and the capital would soon be at the center of a confrontation that required strong and brave warriors. He hinted that under such circumstances there would inevitably be men who could challenge even the likes of Gilbat. The stranger looked away to the horizon and advised Gilbat to return to the capital, for the city was beginning to gather its forces in preparation for the inevitable struggle. After returning to the capital, Gilbat plunged back into fierce battles where his fighting skills sharpened and his senses dimmed. He engaged in brutal battles with monsters that seemed bent on destroying everything in their path. When the streams of monsters had dried up, Gilbat was faced with new battles, with the thugs that filled the streets of the capital. Each new battle, each clash seemed to him just another round in an endless cycle of struggle. As Gilbat continued his countless battles, a strange sense of emptiness grew within him. Each new battle, each new challenge seemed to him not serious enough, too easy. All his enemies were becoming mere puppets to him, whom he smashed with one precise movement, without the slightest excitement or trepidation. Whomever he met, tall or short, strong or weak, each turned out to be just another weak copy of the one who could for a moment at least make him doubt his power. Gilbat was a master in the art of combat, but his soul was weighed down by an endless routine. Every day his opponents seemed to grow stronger, but even their strength could not awaken any real excitement in him. He fought, following his unwavering determination, but there was only one thing inside, a dragging, all-consuming feeling of emptiness. Enemy swords, hammers, and spears failed to seriously wound him once, and Gilbat felt the boredom dragging him down with each battle like a slow poison from which there was no escape. One day, after a long day of fighting, Gilbat lay on the ground looking up at the sky with exhaustion and fatigue. In the silence, a master approached him, a man in whom Gilbat had always found more than a teacher. The master sat down beside him, glancing at the shrine, which lay carelessly. The master's eyes betrayed a look of reproach or mockery as he asked, as if thinking aloud, why the spear, a holy tool and symbol of his power, was lying on the ground like that. Gilbat shifted his gaze from the spear to the master, and then raised his eyes to the sky again. Without taking his eyes off the distant horizon, he turned to the master, asking with a slight chuckle if he had come again with his boring errands and requests that had long since given him neither joy nor satisfaction. The master, looking away, turned away slightly, as if his thoughts were somewhere else. Finally, Gilbat spoke again, breaking the silence. His voice was full of a kind of hopelessness and longing, as if he were trying to express the emptiness that lurked in his soul. He admitted that he felt empty, that each new victory brought only disappointment. He longed to see someone who was as strong as the master, or even stronger, to test himself truly. The master said quietly that it would be really interesting to meet someone who could awaken a spark in Gilbat, who would awaken a strength in him that he himself might have already forgotten. Gilbat turned to the master, his gaze full of distrust and question. He wondered if the master was bored living in this world, surrounded by weak soldiers and weak-willed adventurers who could not challenge him. The master took a deep breath, as if each breath was full of all the wisdom and bitterness of the years he had lived. He said slowly that it was his duty to defend the capital, that he could not retreat and abandon his men, even if it meant he would be forever alone in that destiny. War cannot be won alone, no matter how strong a warrior may be. But he added that one day there would come someone who would be stronger than both of them, who would change their lives, who would bring a fresh wind of change. Gilbat listened to him with wonder and a slight smile that slid across his face. He said ironically that he hoped this day would not come too late for him to enjoy it, otherwise he would die of boredom. His words were a joke, but a real longing slipped into them, as if he realized that he could wait a long time, maybe his whole life. The fight between Gilbat and Null continued like a perpetual whirlwind of collisions and deceptive maneuvers. Gilbat's blows, fierce and merciless, sliced through the air, but invariably flew past, leaving only an echo of frustration. Gilbat, accustomed to overwhelming superiority over his opponents, increasingly noticed that Null, rather than attempting to respond to his attacks, preferred to dodge with a grace that Gilbat had never seen before. For a moment Null approached Gilbat with a look of equanimity, as if he were not at all concerned with the heat of passion around him. He looked at Gilbat and, as if nothing special was happening, said in a low-key manner that he appreciated his opponent's attempts to hold back his strength. But Gilbat should not hold back, for he could speed up if he wished. Gilbat experienced a mixture of surprise and annoyance looking at Nola, who seemed so calm and confident despite the deadly nature of their bout. Gilbat admitted in an apologetic tone that he may indeed have been unconsciously holding back, as if trying to gauge his opponent's capabilities. However, he now realized that there was no point in continuing to hold back the force. Everything inside him screamed that Null was worthy of full power, and there was no reason to avoid it now. With determination, backed by the desire to show his full strength, Gilbat made the decision to strike the final, decisive blow. As if thunderstruck, he burst forward, thrusting his spear forward like a lightning bolt ready to tear the space in front of him. He took aim at Null's legs to immobilize him and deny him the chance to dodge. But at the last split second, Null managed to jump up as if lifted off the ground by the wind. At that moment, Gilbat realized that Null was trapped, or rather, in the perfect position for a final, crushing blow. His spear, sharp and deadly, was already pointed straight at his opponent's heart, and for a moment he experienced the satisfaction of realizing his inevitable victory. But the moment he was about to strike, Null, with a dexterity that seemed impossible, managed to dodge. Gilbat realized that his opponent had used the wooden sword as a fulcrum to instantly change position and get out of the line of attack. This move was so unexpected that Gilbat felt delighted, and at the same time bitter that he had missed again. His spear had missed its target, and it was disappointing. Suddenly Null approached him with inimitable calmness and asked a question, as if not at all frightened. Was Gilbat himself all right? This question made Gilbat boil with anger. Null noted with certainty that Gilbat could attack even faster. This provocation was the last straw. Gilbat felt the rage surging within him. He realized that there was no point in holding back any longer, that his power must manifest itself to its fullest. Gilbat, gathering all his power, made a desperate decision at that moment to use one of the most dangerous techniques in his arsenal, the dragon's annihilating flash. It was a deadly attack at the speed of sound that he had never used against a living person before, knowing that its destructive power would mercilessly sweep away everything in its path. His body seemed to be filled with the fury of an ancient dragon, every muscle tensed like a string, and a wild fire flashed in his eyes. Gilbat was sure, this time Nalu will not escape. The spear lunged forward with incredible speed, heading straight for Null's throat. At that moment, Gilbat was sure that this was the end. His target would not be able to dodge such a deadly blow. Everything was happening so fast that Gilbat himself barely had time to realize that his attack would reach its target. The flash was so lightning fast that the air around him rippled, raising a gust of wind as if a roll of thunder accompanied its movement. But suddenly, in the next split second, the spear changed its direction and flew sideways, as if by an invisible will. Gilbat stood stunned, feeling his confidence and rage give way to confusion and surprise. He could not understand how this could have happened. Gilbat lowered his gaze to the ground and noticed the huge, snaking crack left by his blow, which stretched ominously toward where Null stood. Gilbat, looking at Null, searched for answers, trying to realize what had happened. He could not believe that Null had somehow escaped such a deadly attack. As Null stood on one knee, exhausted and depleted of all his strength, he clearly realized that further resistance against Gilbat would be futile. Feeling the fatigue seeping into every cell of his body, he made the decision to retreat. He asked Gilbat to stop and admitted his defeat. Null left the castle, casting one last glance at it with a mixture of memories of the recent battle and a premonition of change. As he left the place, Null realized that surviving the Gilbat attack had been a true test of his survival. That blow had been so powerful and swift that Null had barely managed to dodge it, using all his skills accumulated from years of training. He realized that in that fight, Gilbat may have only slightly revealed the true power hidden behind outward cold-bloodedness. In order to survive, Null resorted to his best techniques, combining strength and the art of the ninja step that allowed him to become virtually elusive. This technique required tremendous skill and concentration, for any distraction could be fatal. It was only through impeccable accuracy and lightning-fast reaction that he was able to avoid the fatal blow. The realization of how close he was to his doom overturned his habitual beliefs. In the past he could afford to be overconfident, but this fight had shown him how quickly pride could turn against the fighter himself. The realization of weakness came to Null suddenly, like a flash of light in the darkness. He realized that the fight with Gilbat was not only a test of his endurance and skill, but also a lesson in how much more he had to achieve. Now Null knew that to become stronger, he must work hard at working on himself, for next time he would not allow himself to be broken so easily. When Null left the hall, Gilbat was left in silence, surrounded by shadows that lay softly on the cracks in the floor. One of them was a fresh, deep crack, the mark of their furious collision. At first glance, Null looked almost rustic. His modest clothing and calm expression could have misled anyone who met him on the street into mistaking him for an ordinary peasant. But behind this outer shell lay a remarkable physical potential that even Gilbat, an experienced warrior, could not help but recognize. And yet, as much as he admired Null's hidden abilities, Gilbat felt doubt tormenting his thoughts. He did not feel that Null was strong enough to single-handedly slay the Minotaur. In trying to understand where Null's true strength lay hidden, Gilbat involuntarily returned to thoughts of the crack that had appeared beneath the blows of their battle. It seemed to him that the mark was no mere coincidence, but evidence that an unusual opponent had passed before him, perhaps with potential far greater than Null himself realized. It was hard for Gilbat to admit that he had lost, even if it was only a friendly battle. This was the first time he had ever found himself a step behind. He saw how Null, understanding his bitterness, simply backed down, saying he was surrendering to preserve Gilbat's honor before his own men, not to let him feel humiliation. He also remembered Null's last words before he left, and it lit a spark of anticipation in him. Null had promised that this would not be their last meeting, and as he left, he confidently added that next time their fight would be even more exciting. Gilbat smiled at this anticipation. From now on, each of their clashes would not only be a test of strength and skill, but also a game of wits, a tactical and emotional challenge. The next day Null woke up determined to try out the new idea that had flashed across his mind after yesterday's battle. He went to Aunt Stella's house, determined to offer her help in repairing her old gutter. As he approached the gutter, Null paused for a moment, gazing into the neglected gutters covered with dark, congealed mud. He carefully ran the tip of his sword across its surface and felt the sword easily and silently peel away the layers of mud, as if it were a light dust rather than a solid mass. When he had finished, Aunt Stella thanked him with genuine warmth, amazed at how quickly he had managed the job. At that moment, a local boy who had been watching him work approached Null. He was impressed by Null's dexterity and, a little shyly, asked for help with his own problem, fixing a gutter that also needed cleaning a long time ago. Null did not hesitate to agree and, continuing to stare at his sword, set to work again. Null studied the blade of the sword, pondering its durability and magical stability. He recalled the words of Father Rin, who had said that this sword was unique. It was made not only for combat, but also for resilience. The blade did not show a scratch, and despite all the trials, it showed no signs of wear. The sword seemed almost plain in appearance, without ornamentation or frills, but its strength and mysterious resilience amazed Null, and he wondered more and more about its origin. After a while, another local man, who had seen him helping his neighbor, approached Null and also asked him to help clean his gutter. Null, slightly tired but still interested, went back to work, nodding in agreement. Some time later, immersed in the silence after a busy day, Null sat on an old bench near the square and thought. During that day, many residents had asked him for help. Everyone had their own request, their own problem that required decisive action and a strong hand. It happened that there was an accident near the construction site, and he had to cancel some of his planned work. Null realized that his opportunities here in the capital were limited. His assignments were limited to mere household requests and repairs while he was in this rank. A slight annoyance filled him, for the spirit of the recent battle with Gilbat still raged in his heart, and mundane tasks could not douse that inner fire. Absorbed in his thoughts, he did not immediately hear soft footsteps behind him. Suddenly there was a melodious voice behind him, and a question that pierced the silence, taking Null by surprise. Shouldn't he have a lot of work to do? Null flinched, suddenly feeling that the voice was familiar to him. Turning around, he met his gaze with Rin standing in front of him. She looked different from the castle, where she was full of majestic detachment. Here, in this quiet place, her presence seemed more intimate, almost informal. Rin greeted him with a smile, and Null, slightly embarrassed, asked why she was here. Rin took a small step forward and, lowering her eyes, quietly apologized, as if her presence here was violating some invisible boundary. She discreetly explained that, upon discovering he was not in the castle, she had decided to contact the guild master with questions about where Null might be. The master, well aware of the habits of his apprentices, suggested that he might be right here, away from the hustle and bustle of the city, this place where Null liked to spend time alone with his thoughts. She cautiously asked if she was disturbing him, if she had torn him away from some thoughtful reflection or study. Null replied with a brief but expressive movement of his head. His displeasure or irritation was foreign to him, but a slight uneasiness and surprise still gripped him inwardly. He realized that it had taken a great deal of persistence and perhaps even some cunning to find him here. The very fact that she had managed to find him here, in this remote and hidden place where he could go unnoticed, spoke of her ability to be not only observant, but persistent. Null looked at Rin with a puzzled expression and wondered why she was even looking for him here when, in his opinion, everything had been said and decided the day before. Rin took a deep breath, as if she was about to say something important and perhaps even decisive. Thanking him for his visit yesterday, she scrutinized his face. She searched his eyes for an answer, as if assessing whether Null could understand and accept her true intentions. And when the tension between them had reached a breaking point, Rin spoke, revealing to him her main, perhaps most unexpected request. There was much more than just a request in her words. She was asking Nola to let her become his apprentice. At that moment, her voice trembled, but not from fear. It was the trembling excitement of realizing the seriousness of her intention. She didn't just want to learn how to hold a weapon or master the art of combat. She was asking for dedication and a thirst for knowledge, a willingness to overcome her own weaknesses and fears. Ryan remembered an old, almost forgotten legend she had heard when she was a young student at the Royal Training Center. Her teachers had mentioned the legend more than once, telling her about a boy who had an extraordinary will, but no natural aptitude for magic or martial arts. This boy had neither outstanding physical strength nor a special magical gift, but one trait distinguished him from the rest: unyielding persistence, bordering on stubbornness, almost obsession. Rin remembered being told once that this boy had come to the Royal Training Center when he was only 12 years old. Since then, he had worked hard day in and day out, regardless of the taunts and disdainful glances of the other students, mastering all the basic skills of the 6 classes. Legend had it that his story could have been true, could have been fiction, an exaggeration to emphasize the importance of willpower and diligence. To Rin, the story was just a beautiful fiction, nothing more. That's what she thought until she met Nola. When she first saw Null and was able to look into his eyes, full of calm confidence and impenetrable hardness, that legend seemed to come alive for her. Rin looked at Nola thoughtfully, considering exactly how to approach her idea before she spoke. She began the conversation cautiously, explaining that she would like to be his maid. Her words sounded firm, but there was a mixture of uncertainty and hope in her gaze. Null raised an eyebrow and looked at her carefully, perplexed, asking what she meant by a servant and why she would want to be one. He was clearly expecting a more specific explanation and perhaps suspected that her intentions went deeper than first thought. Trying to find the right words, Rin began to explain that in her mind a servant was not just someone who obeyed orders, but a faithful assistant who took on the cares and daily duties of his master. She saw this role as something sacred, a way of self-discovery through service to someone truly worthy of admiration. To her, a servant is more than a servant. It is a person who dedicates themselves to care and support, and in return receives invaluable knowledge and experience. Ryan explained that in their milieu of magicians, such service has always been a traditional and profound process that allows students to draw closer to the wisdom and power of their teachers. She added that for centuries such connections had been called servanthood, although in essence it was akin to teaching and apprenticeship. And that was the path she chose to follow alongside Null. She wanted to follow him, to learn from him in even the simplest, mundane tasks, and perhaps to adopt a piece of his fortitude and understanding of the world. With sincere joy, she added that for her, even that would be enough. The very fact that she would be able to be by his side, to help him, and to observe his actions, would be her reward. She assured him that she would do her best not to trouble him and be a real support. But her words ran into Null's wall of cold silence. Null listened to her in silence and then said dryly that he refused. His refusal was firm, decisive, and seemed non-negotiable. Rin was stunned, her enthusiasm fading instantly. She looked at him perplexed, trying to understand what it was that she had failed to convey to him, what it was in her proposal that could have caused such a harsh reaction. Rin, still stunned by his refusal, tried to figure out what had gone wrong. She frantically searched for a reason why her proposal had been received so coldly. Perhaps he didn't like something she had said yesterday. Or perhaps he sees her only as an inexperienced and young apprentice, incapable of serious work. Rin began to explain that her age was not an indicator, and that she had absolute confidence in her ability to be of use to him. She reminded him that she was considered one of the best at the royal school, and though it might seem otherwise to him, she was talented enough to handle any assignment with dignity. Null, however, looked at her with his usual impassivity. He replied briefly that it was not at all a matter of her talents or lack of experience. Null coldly explained that he did not consider himself capable of teaching her anything, that he himself often lacked knowledge and experience. Moreover, he emphasized that he was used to handling everything on his own and did not need help, even if it came in such a generous and benevolent form. Not willing to give up so easily, Rin tried to offer an alternative. She explained that her family could reward him generously for his tuition, covering any of his expenses. Null, however, only shook his head and discreetly asked her to stop. He wasn't interested in the money or the benefits her presence could bring him. Rin, feeling desperate, made one last attempt. She firmly stated that she was willing to do any errands he assigned her, be it boring chores or dangerous tasks from the guild. She assured him that she would gladly take on anything he saw fit, and would serve with dedication and diligence. But here, too, disappointment awaited her. Null, without changing his expression, reiterated that there was no need for her services. Rin felt the last vestiges of her hope slowly dissolving in the coldness of his detached gaze. She tried to find more words, more arguments, but Null, as if reading her thoughts, said confidently that no means no. His voice sounded firm and unwavering, as if he had put an end to this conversation, leaving her no chance to continue the argument. Rin froze for a moment, her face expressing sudden weakness and confusion. A shadow of resentment flashed in her eyes for a second, but was immediately replaced by a flame of determination. She straightened up rapidly, and as if reborn in anger, she suddenly shouted out that she would prove her strength and fortitude to him. Her voice was ringing, full of stubbornness and defiance, as if the very air around her trembled at her words. She declared confidently that very soon Null would realize how capable and willing she was to face hardship, and she threw him a defiant order to watch her closely. Without wasting a second of thought, Rin raised her wand to the sky, her gaze fixed on the clouds as if she was calling out to the forces of nature herself. At that moment, she used the ice dance skill, and the cold breath of the frost spell spread through the air, attracting swirls of ice and snow crystals to her. They gathered around her like a chilling vortex, gently wrapping around her figure as if protecting her from the world around her. The ice, sparkling in the sunlight like diamonds, surrounded Rin, emphasizing her grace and strength. But she didn't stop there. After a moment, Rin moved on to her next skill, Flame Strike. The tongues of fire, hot and powerful, rumbled forward, nearly consuming the coldness of the ice and leaving behind a light smoke. With the same determination, she pierced the air with a hot fire spell, her voice full of confidence as she explained that it was her favorite technique, and that the skill was called Flame Strike. Flames instantly erupted around her, illuminating everything around her as if nature itself had surrendered to her power. Her demonstration was only the beginning. She gripped the hilt of her sword tighter, her eyes burning brighter than ever. Barely waiting for the flames to end, Rin swung her sword, followed by an even more powerful explosion of energy as she demonstrated the Dragon Strike technique. Her strike was powerful and precise, so much so that a nearby tree split into two halves, as if obeying her mighty will. Her breathing quickened, but her voice remained calm as she proudly explained that it was a secret skill of thieves, and that her mentor was one of the best. Without pausing, Rin prepared for another demonstration, as if nature itself was bending to her will. This time, she decided to demonstrate the Sacred Light skill. A light glow began to emanate from her palms, gradually growing until the entire forest around her was illuminated by a soft but powerful glow. Rin proudly pointed at the light spilling around her, explaining that this skill belonged to the rare skills of the warrior class. She smiled demurely as she mentioned that the special power of this spell was directed against the undead, capable of destroying them with ruthless precision, dispelling darkness and ridding the land of all manner of evil. The flame of determination in her eyes did not die down. On the contrary, it only grew brighter. Her gaze challenged Null, and she said with excitement that she was ready to show him a few more techniques if he wanted to see more. But to her surprise, Null, remaining calm and somewhat detached, shook his head slightly and said quietly that what he had seen was enough. Null watched Ryan's every move, scrutinizing her technique and the grace with which she displayed her skills. He realized that he was facing a true master. Her strength, her confidence, and her eagerness to be useful were impressive, but Null realized that his own abilities couldn't match her prowess. After a brief pause, when Rin asked him to accept her as an apprentice, he felt a strange mixture of respect and sadness. However, realizing her intentions, Null turned her down again, calmly explaining that he simply had nothing to offer her. He possessed no knowledge that could adequately complement her talent, and saw no point in becoming her teacher. He realized that Ryan probably underestimated the difference between their skills, and in her eyes he looked like a powerful and mysterious master, but to him it was an illusion. Null decided that the best way to convey the truth to her was to show, not tell. Rin, determined to prove her dedication and usefulness, stated that despite her successes, she realized that she still had a long way to go to reach Null's level. She mentioned that she had been recognized by all 6 mentors of the various classes, and that this was a rare badge of honor, but there remained a feeling in her heart that for true mastery she needed a mentor like Null. She was sure that by serving him, she would not only be useful, but able to accomplish her goals and comprehend secrets unavailable even in the royal school. Rin began to beg Null to let her stay by his side, to take on any errands, however simple, if it would give her a chance to learn from him. Null looked at Rin carefully, trying to find the words that could explain his position to her. He didn't want to ruin her admiration and eagerness to learn, but he realized that this admiration was based on false ideas about him. At some point he realized that mere words would not be enough. Then Null decided to act and show her his power visually so that she would realize how limited his skills were despite her admiration. Concentrating, Null held a finger up, urging her to pay attention. A spark of fire appeared in the air above his palm and began to grow as if absorbing all the energy around it. Gradually, the spark turned into a fireball that grew in size with each passing second. Rin, amazed by this sight, involuntarily sank into memories of her early years of study. She remembered her teacher, the wise and strict mage Onken, who had once shown her a similar skill. Her memory came to life of the moment when Onken, with his incredible magical power, had created a fireball that could grow larger and more powerful with every stroke of his hand. Then, as a very young girl, she had watched this spell with awe and admiration, seeing it as a symbol of power and skill. Teacher Onken often said that the fireball was not just a basic spell, but a way to test a magician's power, to test the limits of his abilities. He proudly claimed that he had been using this skill to test powers for over 200 years, demonstrating that even basic skills could become majestic in the hands of a skilled mage. Since then, Rin had practiced hard, wanting to replicate her teacher's success and show him that she was capable of mastering the skill at the highest level. Every morning after class she tried to create a fireball with all her will and strength, but the flame in her hands remained small, almost insensible. She realized that she had a long way to go before she reached the level of her teacher and resigned herself to it. But what she saw now was beyond anything she could have imagined. The fireball hovering above Nola's palm was not just large, it was colossal, as bright as the sun itself, and it emanated such heat that the air around it began to ripple. The orb, which seemed immensely powerful and beyond her control, was several times larger than the one her teacher, the great mage Onken, had once shown her. She realized that a new, uncharted level of magical prowess had opened up before her that she could not comprehend or explain. Null looked at his fireball with a slight expression of thoughtfulness on his face. To him, this spell, though it looked impressive, was still the only thing he had truly mastered from everything he had been taught in his magic classes. He realized that his abilities in magic were limited, that this bright orb was the pinnacle of his skills, and he might never reach the level of true mages who could do far more complex and powerful spells. Null finally broke the silence and explained to Rin that this fireball was his only skill that he had been able to truly master. He added that the rest of his skills, regardless of class, be they mage, warrior, or thief skills, were at a similarly low level and not worthy of attention. Null cast an attentive glance at Rin, as if trying to penetrate her thoughts and understand how deep her realization of what he had just shown her was. He asked her if she really understood what the fireball meant and what was behind his humble, almost mundane skill. At this point, Arwen began to reproach herself. What was she trying to accomplish? What was she trying to prove to him? For all those spells she had demonstrated seemed to her now nothing more than a show-off, a clumsy attempt to impress someone who would not be moved by her skills or ambition. Her thoughts drifted back to the day she'd first seen Nola in battle. She remembered how he had single-handedly stopped a Minotaur's death blow, a beast that other warriors could not defeat. She remembered how he had struck back with lightning speed that no ordinary man could keep up with. In that moment, it became clear to her that Nola's strength was of a different nature. It was pure, selfless, seeking neither fame nor recognition. He did not chase success, nor did he seek to prove his worth. His strength seemed to be in the ability to be a pillar for others, remaining in the shadows, leaving the right to be honored to others. Null was a warrior who needed no victory shouts or ringing applause. His true magic was that he was a man of action, a man ready to protect anyone in need. Rin realized that before her was a man with an amazing combination of spiritual and physical strength, so profound that it allowed him to remain unperturbed in any situation, to deal with any threat and, more importantly, to stand his ground without yielding to anyone or anything. Ryan involuntarily thought about her future and the responsibility that would one day fall on her shoulders. She knew that together with her brother she would rule the kingdom, protecting it and the people. And now, more than ever, she realized that to fulfill that duty she would need not just strength, but fortitude, stamina, and an inner peace like she had seen in Nola. He was the embodiment of that ideal to which she had aspired, but had never until this moment been able to accurately describe or realize. She suddenly realized that in her search for strength for her future, she was actually looking for someone who could be her mentor and example. As if sensing this sudden enlightenment, Rin looked at him with new eyes, eyes full of understanding and respect. She admitted to herself that her former self-confidence was merely a mask hiding her inexperience and desire for recognition. Null looked at her in surprise, not immediately realizing what had changed. Her confession and humility stunned him. He knew there was a great deal of inner work and sincere realization behind those words. Rin, on the other hand, now knew that her task was not just to win Nola's approval. She realized that she had to become worthy, that her path now was to learn from him without asking for anything in return. She made a decision for herself to follow him, to observe, to emulate his wisdom and calmness until the day came when he himself recognized her willingness. For the first time, she felt that her search for true power had led her to the man who was the embodiment of all her aspirations. She knew that not only her, but her entire family and the entire kingdom would find favor and protection if she ever reached the level that Null had. Gilbat stood at the huge window, beyond which stretched the majestic expanse of the kingdom. But there was no admiration in his gaze. He was immersed in his thoughts, which seemed increasingly confused and contradictory. Gilbat could not understand what really moved his father when he made such an inexplicable decision to give the ancient and powerful black sword, a symbol of royal power, to a simple man. This decision didn't just surprise him, it shook him to the core. Gilbat pondered over his father's act, which seemed inexplicable and contrary to any reasonable decision. Was it possible to reward Nola so easily with relics, especially such relics that had been obtained at the cost of so many lives and tremendous effort? The gesture seemed to him a blatant generosity bordering on recklessness. Gilbat remembered the stories of his father's youth. In those years, he was not just a king, but a true adventurer, a fearless explorer who was not afraid to challenge the unknown. Together with his guild, bearing the formidable name of the Six Saints, they sought to penetrate the heart of the labyrinth, a dangerous and ruthless place. Each step into the depths of the labyrinth required fearlessness and fortitude, for to stumble would leave them there forever. Months filled with threats, losses, and nights spent on the edge of dream and reality led them to their goal, a relic known as the Unbreakable Sword. This sword was more than just a weapon. It embodied the unwavering power behind its black, shimmering steel. This sword was so incredibly strong that even the holy crystal stone, crafted with the greatest skill by the royal family, could not match it in durability. Legends said that to create it, the mysterious and skillful dwarves used the fangs of ancient dragons, creatures whose strength and power were almost limitless. As much as the truth was desired, the mystery of the sword's origin remained unsolved. No one, not even the most skilled mages and alchemists in the kingdom, could determine exactly what it was forged from, what material was so indestructible. It defied any attack, be it the force of blows, magical spells, or caustic chemicals. Even time seemed to bypass it, leaving the surface of the sword without a single scratch. And now, standing at the window, Gilbat tried to grasp the gravity and significance of the fact that the sword that represented the power and pride of the kingdom was now in the hands of a man far removed from the nobility, from the nobles, from all those who were called to protect and preserve the heritage of their ancestors. He pondered the possible reasons for this decision, imagining how his father, a man with a clear view of the future, was able to see something special in Nola, something hidden from the rest of them. Anxiety was growing in the kingdom, and it all seemed to be a portent of great change. Hidden threats hovered beneath the surface of peaceful diplomacy. Diplomatic relations with many neighbors hung in the balance, and the kingdom was enveloped in an atmosphere of tension that was gradually becoming more palpable. Gilbat suddenly caught himself thinking that perhaps his father had hoped that Null could break these invisible chains that had already held the kingdom back for too long. But at the same time, these thoughts created deep self-doubt in Gilbat. His father was a man who saw farther than others and possessed extraordinary insight. Gilbat felt that he himself lacked this wisdom and foresight, and despite his ambition, he wondered if he could ever reach his father's level. Rin continued to follow Null, barely keeping up with his quick, confident steps. Her ringing voice interrupted the silence. She asked if he was on his way to the guild, and when he nodded in the affirmative, she cheered up even more. Her voice was a little louder now, with a hint of excitement. She suggested that he find an exciting task and, without embarrassment, called him master. Null felt that with Rin's arrival, his usual life began to change, and not quite in the way he had expected. With her arrival, simple tasks became more difficult, as if her presence was disruptive. To distract himself from her scrutiny and regain his sense of independence, he went to the guild, hoping to find some task to distract Ryan and kill time at the same time. But that plan, he soon realized, was almost useless. The effect was the opposite. Her enthusiasm only grew stronger, and Null realized that now he would not simply brush aside her determination. When they entered the guild, Null approached the master, a battle-hardened man known to all the adventurers in the area. The master looked at Null carefully, and his gaze immediately noticed Rin walking beside him. His eyebrow raised slightly in surprise, and he asked Null, without hiding his interest, why the two of them. Rin looked at the master with a serious expression, stating firmly that she was here as a simple adventurer just like everyone else. She gently added that she didn't have to be addressed with the respectful word miss, as if to emphasize her desire to be part of the guild without any privileges or titles. The master chuckled slightly. There was something kind in his gaze, but tinged with a touch of slight bewilderment. He nodded his understanding and apologized for his excessive deference. As soon as the conversation between the master and Rin was over, he leaned slightly toward Null and, lowering his voice to a barely audible whisper, cautiously inquired if anything unusual had happened to him since Rin had been looking for him this morning. The master, being a man of experience and having seen much, had sensed at once something strange in their appearance together, and his suspicions led him to inquire whether Null had done something that might have aroused such an unexpected interest on the part of Rin. Null calmly looked at the master and, not wanting to create any unnecessary rumors or gossip, calmly replied that he had merely given Rin a couple of tips. Null, wanting to quickly divert the master's attention away from himself and Rin, asked him to find them a task suitable for the two of them to work on. He decided that perhaps working as a team would allow Rin to realize that the path of the adventurer was not so simple and that perhaps they were not destined to walk the same road. The master, respecting Nola's request, set to work. He opened a thick leather-bound book containing descriptions of various tasks, every page of which was inscribed with detailed instructions, warnings, and promises of rewards. The master, studying the large ledger of assignments, finally announced that he had found a suitable assignment for their little group. He said that since Rin had a silver rank, he could offer them a mission to exterminate goblins. Null, upon hearing this, he couldn't even contain himself from surprise and shrieked. This was so unexpected to him that he looked at the master incredulously, as if he doubted that he was really speaking seriously. After all, destroying goblins was no easy task, and to demand such a task from novice adventurers seemed to be reckless. The master, noticing Nola's reaction with a slight chuckle, explained that such tasks became more accessible with the participation of the silver rank. However, he added that even assignments below the silver rank could be quite challenging, and there was nothing strange about a seemingly overly ambitious mission. The goblins they were to destroy were 3 ranks lower than Rin's level, but that didn't make the mission a simple stroll at all. The creatures could gather in packs and attack together, turning even a simple task into a dangerous adventure. Null stood, brooding, realizing that this assignment was a chance he had long awaited. He looked at Rin carefully, gauging her reaction, and the girl, sensing his gaze, asked in surprise what was so strange that he had noticed. Null only shook his head, replying that everything was fine. He realized that he had previously intended to cut off any ties with her, but strangely enough, it was her presence that gave him the opportunity to get the much-desired mission. Null looked at Rin carefully, as if trying to read her true intentions and find out how serious she was about the upcoming mission. He asked her if she was comfortable with the mission and if she could be a reliable support in battle. Ryan's answer was immediate. There was not a shadow of doubt in her words. She confidently stated that she was up for the challenge, and added that there was nothing more satisfying to her than to be of service to him. She called him teacher again, with warmth and respect, and there was that strange combination of ease and determination in her voice that could not fail to please Nola. These words of hers caused Nola genuine surprise, but also joy, and yet he could not shake off a slight feeling of unease at having to rely on a very young girl to win. He was uncomfortable with the thought, but the desire to go on this mission was too strong. This opportunity seemed especially valuable to him, as he had never been able to get such missions. Taking a few steps back, Null waved his hand to the master as if saying goodbye and announced that they were ready to go on the mission. The master squinted at him and noticed his haste, and in response he asked with a note of bewilderment where he was in such a hurry and if he was sure of his decision. The master wanted to make sure that Null was aware of all the dangers behind the seemingly simple mission. The master nodded cautioningly and, lowering his voice, added that although the mission might seem uncomplicated, it was still unsafe and he should have been extremely careful. Null, smiling with confidence, assured that he knew himself and was capable of handling any difficulties. Before letting them go, the master told them that the number of suitable missions for the ranks had increased significantly, and if for some reason they couldn't find any goblins, they could engage in gathering rare herbs in that area. The master pointed to the map, carefully pointing out the area they were to explore, and explained in detail where the absorption evidence was located, which was required to complete the mission. He warned them to behave carefully and return alive and unharmed. Null listened attentively to his every word, nodding in appreciation, and finally thanked Master Roger for all the advice and guidance. When all the cautions were given, Null turned to Rin, and their gazes met. At that moment he realized that she too was ready for this path. Without further ado, he bid her set out on her journey, holding his black sword, which seemed not just a weapon, but a symbol of the determination hidden in his heart. They stepped out of the guild, leaving behind the bustle and noisy conversations of the other adventurers, and stepped under a bright sky illuminated by the first rays of the morning sun. The nature around them seemed calm and peaceful, but Null knew that danger might lurk behind this peace. Each step they took brought them closer to where the goblins waited, creatures insidious and dangerous in their unpredictability. Goblins, these lowly creatures of the forest, though seemingly unimportant, pose a threat if their numbers get out of control. Hibernating in the shadowy depths of the forests, they feed on fruit and small animals. But when they become too numerous, goblins begin to encroach on resources and lands, upsetting the delicate balance between nature and humans. Because of this, adventurers are forced to periodically hunt them down to keep their numbers in check. In the north of the kingdom is a forest of monsters. Vast, gloomy, it is full of not only goblins but other sinister creatures as well. This forest has long been a training ground for aspiring adventurers, a challenge to help them grow stronger and develop their skills, and a source of rare herbs and medicines. This is where Null and Rin were headed, armed with a map and determination. Rin peered carefully into the surroundings, and after not seeing a single goblin, she confidently declared that the area was quiet. Null looked at her in surprise, unaccustomed to such calm. The girl explained that usually a few goblins would pop up in the path of the adventurers, as if testing them for strength. However, none were visible now, which led her to think that their numbers might have dwindled. But barely had she finished her musings, her gaze suddenly stopped on a distant point ahead. Rin focused all her senses, applying the detection skill. After a moment, her eyes opened, and with a slight smile, but with seriousness in her gaze, she caught a glimpse of the creature. Deep inside her, an unease moved. The aura emanating from the creature was dark and sinister, much stronger than that of an ordinary goblin. She knew she could not delay, and with a quick nod to Null, she stepped forward as if pointing the way. As they moved deeper into the forest, the strange, ominous silence became more and more palpable. Normally, the dense tree crowns were filled with the sounds of forest life, the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. But now it was as if everything stood still. Null, who was walking behind him, felt the silence weighing on him with every step, giving rise to thoughts of what dangers might lurk in the shadows. Suddenly Rin stopped abruptly, her gaze drifting downward, as if she were trying to find something invisible to the others. It was at this very spot that her ability was showing the goblin's mark, but there was no sign of him around, no sign of him. The thought flashed through her mind that perhaps the goblin had died of old age or was afflicted by some disease. But that didn't explain the dead silence of the forest, as if there was a fear that overshadowed all life here. Rin stopped suddenly, sensing something strange and disturbing sweeping around her. Her gaze froze, and she held her breath, as if in an attempt to catch the invisible threat piercing the air. Gradually her gaze shifted to her own hand, and to her surprise, she saw dark spots on the skin that looked like drops of blood. At that moment, Null also sensed something ominous in the air. His gaze drifted forward, and he noticed a dark, motionless silhouette lurking in the depths of the forest shadows. Null gestured to Rin, and she, sensing the gravity of the moment, instinctively activated a protective spell, as if her body was adjusting itself to the rhythm of the ominous surroundings. They began to approach the silhouette, and with each step, the feeling of terror became more and more pronounced. At last a gruesome sight appeared before them. A massive creature bent over the body of a dead goblin, devouring it with monstrous greed. Rin stood gazing at the giant creature before her, trying to comprehend what she was seeing. Her gaze darted about, trying to find confirmation of her thoughts, and then she noticed the magical stone on the monster's forehead. A realization swept over Rin like a cold wave of fear, for before her stood none other than the Goblin Lord. The Goblin Lord, the oldest and most powerful of the creatures of his kind. This monster, who was once the king of the goblins, had gone through unimaginable changes. Through a terrible mutation caused by magical experimentation, he has become a monster full of dark power and sinister might. Studies of ancient manuscripts and mysterious ritual texts suggest that the Goblin Lord is an ancient being, born not of nature but created through forbidden, almost forgotten techniques. His whole being was the embodiment of forbidden knowledge, the product of human hands that sought to comprehend the mysteries of nature and to wield power beyond the reach of ordinary beings. This monster was the epitome of destruction, and its power could descend upon the world like a catastrophe equal in power to the most serious threats of rank A. Rin watched it, fascinated and frightened at the same time. The monster exceeded her conceptions of goblins. Its size was so incredible that it made the Goblin King from the legends seem like a small creature in comparison. She realized that ordinary attacks would be powerless against such a force, and that even experienced adventurers of the golden rank would not dare to engage him without risking their lives. Unlike other goblins that fed on berries or small animals, this monster was a flesh-hungry predator, making it even more dangerous. Gradually, Rin realized that her own strength was not enough for this battle. Her hand clutching her wand trembled, betraying her own fear and uncertainty. The image of the Minotaur, who had once put her in a similar position, came to mind, and the feeling of helplessness that had gripped her then came again. In the midst of these reflections, she was brought back to her reality by the presence of Nola. Null, having assessed the situation, confidently said that the enemy was only a goblin, and suggested that he should be destroyed. This phrase sounded like a challenge, as if it was a belief in his own strength and Rin's strength. They had to finish off this monster, and despite her fear, her desire to act strengthened. Null, looking at the Goblin Lord, began to realize that this was not just an ordinary goblin as he had assumed. He wondered, for a goblin was usually the weakest creature, and in front of him stood someone much more powerful and intimidating. Rumors about goblins were often untrue, and now he understood this from his own experience. Null stood before the monster, his mind unable to comprehend the full true nature of the enemy. He was convinced that it was just an ordinary goblin, an ordinary creature that he was about to face. Null couldn't imagine that this monster frozen before him was considered a common opponent for newcomers. But at the same time, no matter how strong this enemy was, it was already standing in front of him, and there was no way to retreat. At this moment, Null wanted to ask Rin a question, seeking to gain confidence in his actions. But excitement restrained him. Every movement seemed heavy, and his legs, as if numb, did not obey. He realized that these first steps toward becoming an adventurer required his full concentration, and without wasting time, he needed to decide how to deal with this terrible creature. But at the same time, no matter how strong this enemy was, it was already standing in front of him, and there was no way to retreat. At this moment, Null wanted to ask Rin a question, seeking to gain confidence in his actions, but excitement restrained him. Every movement seemed heavy, and his legs, as if numb, did not obey. He realized that these first steps toward becoming an adventurer required his full concentration, and without wasting time, he needed to decide how to deal with this terrible creature. And so the Goblin Lord, realizing the threat, rushed to attack, and Null, overcoming his fear, realized that this was his moment. Using his parrying skill, he reacted quickly to the monster's swift movement, his sword meeting the blow with the precision he had relied on in training. With each new attacking move, Null reflected the blows, studying his opponent's fighting style, noting his weaknesses. He felt each clash echoing in his body as if each blow could be decisive. After the third blow, as his muscles began to tire, he shouted to Rin, urging her to act. She had to use her abilities to help him. Together, Null and Rin continued to attack the Goblin Lord, acting coherently as if their movements had been rehearsed in advance. Rin, focused on her target, was still pondering how amazingly fast the goblin was moving with such a huge size. It was a violation of all natural laws, and her heart filled with determination as she activated her ice dance skill. However, at this critical moment, huge logs flew at them from the sky, which were ripped out with roots by the Goblin Lord. As if not noticing their efforts, he hurled them towards Nola and Rin with fury, aiming to break their defenses. Null, seeing this, shouted loudly to Rin, trying to warn her of the danger from the flying trees. Rin, instantly assessing the situation, confidently replied that she was fine. But her voice soon filled with alarm when she noticed two huge logs flying straight at Nola. Null, sword clutched in hand, rushed into the fight, fending off blow after blow, but felt the inner tension building with each attack. He was aware that goblins were fast and clingy, but he did not realize how much of a threat this could be to them. The realization was maturing in his mind that if they didn't change their approach, he was risking not only his life, but Rin's life as well. He was determined to protect her, but realized that at this rate they would not be able to deal with this threat. At this moment, Rin gathered all her magical energy and activated her Hurricane Flash skill. A powerful stream of energy burst into the space around her, blinding everything with its bright light and creating a vortex around them. A few seconds later, as the blinding magic dissipated, Null approached Rin. He, full of admiration, praised her for her display of strength and courage. Null, realizing that now was their only chance to win, offered to protect her while she struck. However, Rin, with a slight smile but full of determination, replied that it would not work that way. Her attention was drawn to the Goblin Lord's left arm, and she pointed to it, showing Nola that it had been torn off during her previous spell, the Ice Dance. But now, the monster's arm had already fully recovered, and this made her heart clench with alarm. This meant that their attacks were pointless. Every wound they inflicted disappeared as if it had never existed. She realized that the monstrous ability came from the magic stone located on the goblin's forehead, which was probably the source of its power. Null, sensing the rising tension, asked if that meant they needed to retrieve the stone somehow. Rin nodded, but her expression turned serious when she remarked that the Goblin Lord was too fast and agile for them. Null agreed with her, realizing that no matter how much he tried, catching up and attacking the monster was impossible. He fell into deep thought, analyzing the situation and trying to find a way to change the course of the battle. Suddenly, he remembered the wind magic that Ryan had just used, and the thought shone in his mind. He wondered if she could channel this powerful skill to him so that he could use it as a protective shield that would allow him to advance towards the monster and disarm it. Rin, focused on what was happening, instantly remembered her hurricane spell. Confidence filled her, and she replied that this magic was indeed capable of bringing down an entire wall, destroying everything in its path. Null stood so that his sword served as a defense for his back, and his face filled with determination as he expressed his confidence that this sword would be his tool to pierce through the monster's defenses. He knew that if they couldn't deal with the speed and power of the goblin's attacks, they would never be able to overpower this dark red magic stone that gave it tremendous strength and protection. Rin nodded in agreement with his suggestion, and Null, determined and grateful for the support, felt that they had a chance to win. Gathering her thoughts, Ryan prepared for the next step, her heart pounding in unison with the pulsation of magical energy building up inside her. She concentrated, confidently activated the Hurricane Flash skill, and a powerful stream of energy burst into space like a storm, heading straight for Null. At this moment, Null also used physical amplification, feeling his muscles fill with power, as if the very air around them trembled with the power of their combined magic. Null was advancing rapidly, tearing through every obstacle in his path. His body, electrified with magical energy, reacted to every movement with incredible sensitivity. He could feel every cell of his being filling with power, eager to burst forth, and the further he walked, the stronger the pressure inside became. It was so intense that it felt like he was about to be torn apart. Two skills were working simultaneously in his mind, recovery and stealth. Null focused his attention on the Goblin Lord, watching his movements carefully. The monster, sensing the approach of the enemy, began to realize their tactics and prepared to dodge the intended blow. The tension in the air was increasing with every second, and Null felt his instincts kicking in, warning him that this moment would be crucial to the outcome of their battle. Suddenly, Null was right next to the Goblin Lord, and his heart pounded frantically in his chest as he realized that the monster had finally fallen into his trap. For a moment, everything around them seemed to freeze, and the world around them became a silence in which only the pounding of his heart could be heard. He gathered all his strength, prepared his body to jump, and in the next second, gathering his fist, he rushed forward, aiming his sword directly at the magic stone glittering on the monster's forehead. The goblin screamed furiously, realizing that this was his end. Null had defeated a huge goblin, a triumph that few people could achieve. However, at this time, very different events were taking place in the royal capital, full of tension and uncertainty. Gilbat, sitting at his desk, immersed in reading reports, realized that time was running out and it was necessary to act quickly. He realized that the imminent threat required an immediate solution, and every moment mattered. Suddenly, a knock on the door interrupted his musings. Behind it came voices brimming with tension that said they had urgent news. Gilbat, nodding at the entrance, allowed them to enter, anticipating that their messages might prove decisive. A man entered the room filled with tension and anticipation, holding a mysterious stone that had been torn from the goblin's forehead. Gilbat, intrigued and wary at the same time, began to scrutinize it. The man in front of him could barely contain his excitement and surprise, stating that he couldn't believe it was the Goblin Lord. However, judging from the purity of the magic stone, it meant that the monster possessed monstrous strength and magnitude that was hard to imagine. Several mysterious hooded figures stood beside it, their faces hidden from the light, and this created an atmosphere of intense secrecy. The man continued his speech, explaining that the report said that this goblin was many times larger than even the Goblin King. Gilbat, frowning, nodded, realizing that his fears were justified. This was indeed a unique magic artifact. He wondered if they had any idea where the stone that now blazed in the hands of their informant might have come from. The man, with a serious expression on his face, explained that only the Devil Heart sect from the religious state of Misura could create such magical stones, and this information sharpened Gilbat's alarm. He realized that to allow such a monster possessing a magic stone of this size to walk around unhindered was to endanger not only his life but also the life of the entire kingdom. He, shocked, stated that he was amazed at the courage and power with which Null and Rin were able to defeat such a monster. This creature dwelt deep within the depths of the forest of demonic creatures, isolated from the world and closely guarded. The terrifying monster was hidden under a cloak of high-level presence concealment magic, making it practically invisible to the eyes of ordinary people and even experienced trackers. The man standing next to Gilbert continued to explain that the monster was reportedly placed in the forest just a few days before the princess discovered it. This information impressed Gilbert deeply, and he couldn't help but wonder how such a powerful creature was able to remain undetected for so long. Gilbert shook his head and turned to his interlocutor with concern and bewilderment. He didn't understand how presence concealment magic was able to bypass the royal capital's intelligence systems, which were designed to detect even the most insignificant magical anomalies. Gilbert, indulging in reflection, realized that the possibility of transport magic was completely ruled out. If someone tried to guide the Goblin Lord through the summoning circles, the sensors guarding the capital would immediately react to any fluctuation in the magic field. Gilbert, realizing the gravity of the situation, asked the man if he had found anything else in the vicinity that could shed light on what had happened. The man, sighing slightly, replied that there weren't many adventurers in the forest right now, as the hunting season hadn't started yet, and many adventurers preferred to stay in the capital, waiting for a better time to hunt. He continued, explaining that although the number of goblins had indeed decreased significantly, the guild leader had sent an urgent request to the royal palace 3 days ago, asking them to suspend as many skirmishes as possible so as not to aggravate the situation. This message made Gilbert even more anxious. He realized that if things were the same in other regions, it could mean that the threat was growing. The man handed him the report Gilbert had previously asked about. It consisted of records of all the strange occurrences that had happened in the county over the past 3 months. Gilbert quickly opened it and began to read. His eyes ran over the lines about the increasing number of missing pets in recent weeks. Cats and dogs had disappeared without a trace. An old man who had gone for a walk never returned, and the sudden disappearance of a local husband had sparked a wave of rumors. In addition, residents complained about the abnormal silence that prevailed in the forest, which frightened their pets, causing them to behave restlessly. Gilbert realized that all of these facts might seem unrelated, but upon closer analysis it became clear that there was a connection, something more than just random occurrences. He shifted his gaze to the map, and his heart squeezed as he realized that all of these events had occurred in roughly the same area. It wasn't just a coincidence. His mind whirled in search of answers, and he ordered his men to go to this dangerous area immediately. He ordered to call in experts who could detect and eliminate presence concealment magic to identify possible threats. Gilbert, realizing the gravity of the situation at hand, gave strict orders to immediately assemble a group known as the Righteous Six. This elite group of adventurers was renowned for their unique skills and experience in dealing with the most dangerous adversaries, and only they could deal with the threat that loomed over the kingdom. He told his subordinates to get down to business at once, without delay, for every second mattered. He also emphasized that as soon as everyone was assembled, he would immediately inform the king of what was happening. This step was necessary to make sure that the royal leadership was aware of the growing threat and could take appropriate action. The warriors surrounding Gilbert, sensing the seriousness of his intentions, nodded in agreement and immediately set out to carry out his orders. Left alone, Gilbert sank down in his chair, sinking into gloomy meditations. His mind was filled with anxious thoughts of the possible threat that loomed over his people. Suddenly, seized with anger, he threw the report to the floor where it unfolded as a symbol of his confusion and guilt. He realized that he should have noticed it earlier. His intuition had warned of impending danger, but he had failed to react in time. Thoughts of how far his enemies had gone depressed him. Images of the devilish empire surfaced in his mind. He had once hoped for the possibility of an alliance with them, believing that they could become allies in the fight against common enemies. But now that he realized their true intentions, this alliance seemed an illusion, and he could not shake off the feeling of betrayal. The growing threat posed by these dark forces awakened in Gilbert a new feeling of concern for the fate of his people. He clenched his fists tightly, realizing that the nation he had sworn to protect was gradually heading toward destruction. The guild master, immersed in reading the report provided by Null on their last mission with the goblins, was amazed at the magnitude of the work that had been done. In his opinion, judging from the fact that Null hadn't suffered any serious injuries, it could be concluded that the last mission hadn't proven to be too difficult. However, he doubted that Null would have been able to defeat the goblin on his own alone, and it made him wonder what role Rin had played in their victory. Null, with a slight smile on his lips, replied that Rin had given him a decent amount of help in the battle, and his voice sounded proud. At this moment, he wanted to celebrate his first victory over the goblins, which was an important step for him to become a true adventurer. The master, looking at Null with an ironic smile, asked if he had asked the princess to do all the work for him, while teasing him about his youth and inexperience. Null, slightly embarrassed, tried to justify himself by saying that he was only a little help, and without Rin, he probably wouldn't be alive anymore. But Rin, without waiting for him to finish his word, exclaimed that this was not true, and that she had not helped him as much as he thought. The master, reflecting on Rin's words, explained that for newcomers, even a single goblin could pose a serious threat. He reminded them that they should be grateful for such a useful experience they had gained during the mission. Null, still thinking about what he had encountered, said that he could never have imagined a goblin as huge as the one they had fought, and that his weakness lay in the magic stone on his forehead. The master, surprised by his words, asked what exactly Null was talking about and what stone was meant. Null explained that the stone looked like a diamond that glowed a bright red-purple color, and this realization made the master think of the magic stone that was usually found on goblins. The master expressed his surprise, saying that when goblins appeared, such stones were either in their heart or throat, which greatly increased their power. After listening carefully to their story, the master decided to check with Nola to see if they had indeed fought a goblin. Null, confident that he was right, reported that Ryan could confirm it. In response, Rin nodded, confirming his words, and, with determination in her voice, said that it was indeed a goblin, and they had witnessed its fall themselves. The master, frowning, remarked that this was very strange, and immediately asked if they had brought any proof of their assertions. Null, immersed in reminiscence, hesitated, trying to recall the details. He remembered how tightly he had held that magic stone in his hands after the goblin had fallen to the ground, its final weakness evident. Without that stone, the monster would not be able to recover. Null asked Rin to help him with this matter. Without hesitation, she used her magic, burning the stone before his eyes. Null looked at the master and, with slight embarrassment, reported that the stone had been burned. The master, infuriated by this statement, shouted that without proof Null could not be paid for his efforts. Then, enraged even more, he asked Null what he should do now with his assignment. However, to Null's surprise, he ended up giving him a few coins to make up for the lack of proof. Null, feeling perplexed, accepted the money, and the master, after congratulating him on the successful start of his career as an adventurer, stated that all was well, and that he had faith in Null's ability to deal with ordinary goblins. Ryan, realizing it was time to say goodbye, stood up and, after wishing everyone a good evening, headed for the exit. Null, looking at her hopefully, asked if she would agree to go with him next time. Rin happily agreed, which added to Null's confidence that their next mission together would be a success. Gilbat, energetically entering the guild, immediately noticed the presence of Rin and Nola standing at the exit. His face lit up with surprise as he realized that they had been here all this time, discussing their recent adventures. Rin, noticing her brother, could not hide her surprise. She looked at him joyfully, forgetting for a moment all the worries of their latest mission. The master at his side grinned as he noticed that the prince had also come to see Null, which added lightness to the atmosphere. However, Null, sensing their attention, faltered, not knowing how to properly behave in front of Gilbat. Gilbat, who approached Null with a serious expression on his face, bluntly stated that he had an urgent request for him. He explained that tomorrow Null needed to go with Rin to a mountain town far away from the capital. At the same time, he emphasized that he had prepared a carriage and attendants for them, but there was no time for detailed explanations now. His attentive gaze left no room for doubts. He knew that only they could help the situation and urged Nola not to refuse. The next morning, Null and Rin, full of expectations and aspirations, left the royal capital. This mission they were about to undertake was essentially considered a matter for the guild itself, and so their master, showing all his foresight, granted Null a special permit. This authorization allowed him, a young adventurer of rank F, to take part in such a significant mission. The master also urged Null to do his best for a good reward, but the true reason why Null accepted this mission was quite different. He was looking forward to his first carriage ride, and the thought of just taking a ride while enjoying the beautiful views overwhelmed him. It was all he had ever wanted, for he had never left the confines of the capital. Deep in his heart, he was fueled by a desire to explore uncharted lands, and he hoped that he would get a chance to see the border regions. Every minute of waiting seemed to be filled with the atmosphere of a new adventure, and he eagerly searched for what awaited him beyond the horizon. As they settled into the carriage, chatting and laughing merrily, Ains suddenly turned to Null with a serious tone. There was a note of apology in her voice for involving him in this adventure. But Null, smiling, hastened to assure her that, on the contrary, he was sincerely grateful to her for the opportunity to be a part of this exciting journey. Their itinerary started from a town in the mountainous region of Toros, which was northwest of the capital. There they were going to make a brief stop to rest and continue their journey to the religious state of Misura, where new experiences and perhaps dangers awaited them. It was now harvest season in the country, and Null, for the first time in his life, could enjoy views of the picturesque fields that stretched to the horizon. Null had the opportunity for endless exploration and discovery, for he was now a true adventurer. The world around him was becoming more and more intriguing, filled with mysteries and exciting adventures. Ahead of him awaited not just ordinary fields, but stunning landscapes that would unfold before him like picturesque paintings, filled with bright colors and unusual creatures. Ains, sitting next to him, noticed his tense expression. She told him with a slight smile that there was no need to be so formal. After all, she was his guide on this mission. There was a confidence and friendliness in her voice that spurred Nola on. He replied that, despite that, he was quite capable of fending for himself. He liked working alone and felt he could handle any challenges. But Ains, as an experienced adventurer, reminded him of her powerful defense, a shield that she could activate if necessary. At that moment, she demonstrated her skill by summoning a divine shield, and a dazzling radiance filled the space around them, giving the moment an atmosphere of magic and power. Null was amazed by this display of power and, with admiration in her voice, asked if this was really her special skill. Ains, smiling, replied that he could always take cover behind her in case of danger, for her defenses could usually withstand any blows from magic and weapons. For Null, this information was a real encouragement. He realized that he had not just a guide by his side, but a strong ally who could help in the most difficult situations. He thought about it, realizing that Ains was remarkably similar to the guy he had trained with at the military training ground. Memories of that courageous young man surfaced in his mind. He was truly strong and inspired respect. It was rumored that Ains, like that boy, could single-handedly fight a dragon, and their skills must have been on the same level. That thought gave Nalu confidence. Knowing that he had an experienced fighter like Ains by his side, he felt he could relax. After all, she was his guide on this mission. However, while doing so, he realized that it was best for him, a newcomer who was not yet accustomed to danger, to avoid the first attacks, especially against stronger opponents such as goblins. Nal looked out the carriage window, and suddenly something strange caught his attention. The fields stretching beyond the road were riddled with unfamiliar footprints. These tracks looked as if someone or something had moved across them, leaving behind visible evidence of its existence. A feeling of unease began to rise in his chest, and he felt his instincts telling him to be alert. Ains noticed Null staring intently out the window and, without waiting for his explanation, asked him herself if he had noticed anything suspicious. Null, after a little hesitation, explained that something strange was felt in the fields, some movement that should not have been there. Ains and Rin, attracted by his words, looked outside in friendship. However, what they saw did not bring comfort. The sky was covered with black clouds from which thick black smoke was rising, veiling the sunlight and creating an ominous atmosphere around. Rin, gripped by fear, cried out that there was indeed something in that smoke, and her voice sounded with a disturbing tinge. After gathering their wits, they activated the presence concealment elimination spell to clear up the situation. As the magic did its work, a strange creature appeared on the field. It towered over the surrounding landscape, baring its fangs ominously. Next to it was a boy, clearly frightened and confused, who seemed to be in deep shock at what was happening. Rin, dumbfounded at this sight, felt her heart beat faster, for something terrifying had appeared in front of them. At this moment, Null could not contain himself and, giving himself over completely to the instinct of a defender, rushed into battle. A creature, majestic and menacing, stood directly over the boy, who, seized with terror, fell to the ground as if trying to escape imminent danger. The boy lay on the ground, his body pressed to the ground in a defenseless posture, and his expression distorted with fear. He stared up at the huge creature that loomed above him like a shadow ready to swallow him. The creature raised its massive paw, exposing sharp claws that seemed capable of tearing through even the strongest iron. A sound like a muffled growl escaped its throat, heralding impending disaster. At the moment the creature's paw was preparing to deliver the fatal blow, Null, sensing the rising anxiety, rushed forward. He did not hesitate to activate his combat skills, his sword gleaming in the light of the dim daylight. The moment the creature's paw came down, Null managed to run up and deflect the blow with force, his sword meeting the claws, making a sharp, piercing sound like scrap metal. Null, in an effort to maintain his position and prevent the monster from striking again, gathered all his strength and focused on the attack. He did not realize what this huge creature lurking in the fields was, but one thing was certain: it was stronger than any enemy he had faced before, and it was full of mystery. 200 years ago, demons declared war on the religious state of Misura, seeking to subjugate humanity and establish their dominance. However, their plans collapsed and they were defeated, causing their people to become aimless wanderers roaming the devastated lands. Outwardly, the demons did not differ from humans, but possessed the unique ability to manipulate monsters by summoning them with ancient magic. These creatures often became instruments of destruction, wiping out entire cities in an instant. In response, the people of Misura organized large-scale hunts, and the demons began to slowly disappear from the faces of their lands. The religious state offered generous rewards for catching and destroying the remaining demons, which hastened their disappearance. In an abandoned field flooded with dim light, a man stood over a boy, tired and weary. A fist came down forcefully on his face, and the boy felt bitterness stirring in his soul. The blow was so hard that the boy felt his consciousness clouded for a moment, and his heart beat at a frantic rhythm. Every time he looked up, he was being punished, a brutal beating that seemed endless. This man, ruthless and overbearing, never left him alone, treating him like an animal. The boy did not understand why he was still here in this merciless place full of suffering and tears. He wondered about his existence, whether he was not created only to suffer and endure torment. One gloomy day, gathering all his courage, he dared to ask his tormentors this question, hoping for some explanation, or at least pity. But this courage ended in a new beating, and his face was disfigured from the cruel blows, leaving deep scars that became a constant reminder of his helplessness. His body suffered terrible torments, a 3-day punishment during which he was deprived of everything but water. In spite of all these terrible ordeals, he did not harbor hatred for his tormentors. Deep down the boy understood them. He knew what it was like to inflict pain on others and feel it on himself. This understanding may have made him stronger, but with each pain, despair and hopelessness grew in his soul. However, when they learned of his ability to read their minds, their hatred for him only grew, and this became a new source of his suffering. They found it disgusting, full of contempt, as expected of the foul demons they were trying to get rid of. So every day the boy was subjected to new humiliations, his body and spirit becoming more and more desiccated by the endless pain. His body gradually became accustomed to the torment and he learned not to show emotion, although deep down his experiences remained alive. One day one of his tormentors, with fury in his eyes, declared that if the boy would obey, and not ask unnecessary questions, he could enjoy a delicious meal. This promise seemed sweet but deceptive. The man then showed the boy a huge monster summoned to do the dirty work. The boy looked in horror at this monster whose huge shadow loomed over him, filling his heart with fear. His mind was swarming with thoughts as to why he couldn't read this man's thoughts, and it was probably due to the magic ring he wore. The boy knew that the man towering over him always kept his promises. Even though he constantly subjected him and his friends to brutal torture, the promise of a food reward was always something he could hope for. Disobedience always meant punishment, while obedience in their eyes could bring rewards. These rules were clear and not to be questioned. The boy, in the end, had no choice and with his head down, chose the path of obedience. This decision was not to his liking, but he knew he had to kill to survive. As he walked across the field, he felt conflicting emotions struggling inside him. He realized how foolish it was of him to think that it was better to hurt others than to be beaten himself. Fear of punishment, fear for his friends, these were the feelings that pushed him down this horrible path. Now he was going to take someone's life, not just harm them as he had done before. This was a serious decision, and the boy realized that if he disobeyed, a terrible reckoning awaited him and his friends. He paced beside the monster that served as his guard, and knew he must rid himself of the target to prove his loyalty. Suddenly the boy, feeling the tension building, saw the spell enveloping them with protective magic begin to dissipate. At first he couldn't understand exactly what was happening. It was enhanced presence concealment, a powerful magic that allowed him and his companion to remain undetected. Feelings of anxiety and confusion flared within him. He could feel a wave of panic surging over him. This dissipating spell suddenly filled him with fear and hopelessness. In that instant, he realized that he had distracted himself by no longer following the eyes of his guard, the monster that was beside him. Now he could no longer manipulate this black dragon of death, whose power and anger were awe-inspiring. The boy, realizing the gravity of the situation, felt a weight of helplessness come over him. He had no time to reactivate his mind control magic, which only increased his despair. Thoughts of his uselessness and worthlessness filled his head like black clouds ready to burst into a storm. He realized that his friends might now be in danger because of his failure, and the thought brought him unbearable pain. He felt sadness, but soon a new realization came: death could be his salvation. This strange but partly comforting realization filled his heart. From time to time he wished that he could no longer hurt others and not suffer endlessly himself. At this critical moment, when the dragon's paw, majestic and menacing, loomed over him, he wondered what he would be like if he had a second chance at life. He dreamed of being a useful man in another life, of no longer being beaten, and of being able to enjoy simple pleasures such as good food. This vision became his only solace in the harsh reality that surrounded him. However, at this critical moment, when hope of rescue seemed almost hopeless, Null, who just happened to be nearby, rushed into action. He managed to repel the dragon's powerful blow as if time had stopped for a moment. The dragon towering above him radiated such power and menace that even the bravest warrior might have trembled before its majesty. But Null did not give up. Clutching his sword with determination, he began to strike, each one filled with all his strength and energy. He continued to attack, not allowing himself to hesitate, even though this creature was unusually strong. Null noticed that this thing was very strong, but at the same time, it was somehow slow, as if it was trying to choose the moment for a crushing blow. The thought flashed through his mind that he might be able to hold off this horrible creature at least until Ryan and Ains arrived to help. But suddenly the dragon stopped, its bright eyes glittering like two sharp swords, full of rage and malice. He seemed about to do something, and in the next instant, as if the world around him had frozen in anticipation, he let loose a huge black ball that rushed straight toward Nola. Dazed, Null froze in place, unable to figure out what to do. The thought flashed through his mind that if he ducked, the boy behind him would be hurt. He had no choice in this terrible moment, and this realization awakened in him a sense of hopelessness. Gathering his wits, Null tried to dispel this dark ball with his sword, but his confidence was shaken when he suddenly stopped, sensing something strange filling the air. Black spray flew around him like a rain of rattling shadows, and Null found himself enveloped in it, as in a dark veil that clutched him in its embrace. Every drop that hit his skin left a searing trail behind it, as if the darkness itself were trying to engulf him. Feeling terrible, Null realized that the black spray mixing with the air filled his lungs, and he began to gasp as if someone were squeezing his chest. A black liquid flowed from his nose, and he realized that it was poison entering his body, poisoning him. He felt a growing restlessness, his vision grew dim, and his body, formerly full of energy, now suffered terrible pain, as if fire were eating him from the inside out, leaving only a bitter sense of impending doom. Null suddenly remembered Ains trying to tell him something important before he rushed forward toward the dragon, and his heart clenched with anxiety. The very minute he decided to take that risky step, he realized that perhaps she was trying to warn him of the poison already enveloping them. Now Ains stared dazedly at him, her eyes full of fear and helplessness. At this time Rin, seeing that Null was in such a dangerous situation, immediately rushed to her aid, her heart pounding so hard that it seemed it could be heard at a distance. But Ains, gripped by panic, shouted at her not to go any further, warning her that any mistake could cost her life. Rin froze, her resolve instantly replaced by anxiety as she realized that her help could only make the situation worse. Ains, under the weight of responsibility, felt in that moment that it was her duty to protect Nola and Rin. But at the same time a dark thought entered her mind: she might have to leave Nola here in this hell. Ains remembered how the prince had given her a separate secret mission. This mission was no ordinary one. It was filled with gravity and importance, requiring her complete focus and courage. The prince explained to her that ahead, they might be facing the greatest threat of their lives, one that could change the course of their destiny and the fate of the entire earth. His eyes read worry, as if he was trying to convey to her the gravity of the coming ordeal. He had warned her that in the unfortunate event that darkness threatened their existence, she would have to accompany Rin and Nola to the religious state of Misura and give them refuge there. The thought filled her soul with anxiety, for she realized that it was on her decisions that the lives of her friends might depend. However, now, in this confused time, they could no longer go that way, and fear for the future gripped her. Ainz wondered if this ambush had been planned in advance, for such a threat could not just arise. At the same time, they were very close to Mountain Town, and if the dragon pursued them, the innocent people might be in mortal danger. Her mind was darting around, searching for possible solutions. But as time went on, she realized that perhaps the demon had indeed led them here, to this trap. Although Null had rushed to the rescue without analyzing what was going on, she, as a knight, had to think through the intricacies of the situation. It was her duty to take care of others, but at this moment she was lost in thought. She wondered, what if this boy wasn't a demon at all? And the thought flashed through her mind like a spark in the darkness. If so, he was incredibly lucky to be in such a dangerous situation with Null. Ainz still continued to stare at Null, and her thoughts carried her far away from reality. She remembered that tense moment when Null, full of determination, had rushed toward the dragon, his heart pounding in his chest from adrenaline and fear. At the very moment he lunged into battle, she could have stopped him, grabbed his sleeve and pulled him back to safety. But she only watched him walk away into the shadows of danger. Alarm and despair flashed in her eyes, and gathering her strength, Ainz shouted to Rin that the dragon was about to release the poison anew, her voice sounding sharp as a knife piercing the silence. She begged her to be more careful, but the words seemed too weak to awaken common sense in the panic. Rin, sitting on the ground, felt her body fill with heaviness, and thoughts of Nola raged in her mind. She couldn't help but think about him, what he was doing, and the danger he was putting himself in. Ainz said bitterly that there was nothing more they could do, and the thought loomed over her like a dark cloud. There was confusion in her voice, reflecting the gravity of what they were all experiencing at this terrible moment. She added that Nola might not be alive anymore, and that realization pierced her heart, leaving a cold mark there. Looking at the black smoke that enveloped everything around her, she thought of the fact that this black fog, like death, might have already swallowed Nola, and perhaps he had indeed met his end. In the next second, after gathering her wits and making a decision, she used her shield skill again, summoning a powerful magic field around her that could repel the enemy's attacks. Surrounding herself and Rin, she felt the shield energy fill her, reinforcing her belief that they could survive. Ainz shouted, urging Rin to be careful, signaling that the next dragon attack was coming, and her voice, full of panic, echoed across the battlefield. Rin, frightened and confused, reacted instantly, but her movements were slowed by anxiety. Ainz concentrated all her magical power at that moment, and the shield, arising from nowhere, shone very brightly, like a bright star illuminating the darkness. Ainz then strengthened her defense, trying her heart out to make it impervious to any attacks, to protect Rin from the impending threat. She knew her friend's life was at stake, and she could not let the dragon destroy all they held dear. Rin, for her part, watched the birds around her begin to fall, their bodies poisoned by the dragon's venom as they helplessly plummeted from the sky. The scene only increased her fear, reminding her that she herself could be the next victim. Unable to contain her emotions, Rin screamed, urging Nola to return. But Ainz, full of anxiety for her friend's life, interrupted her, asking her not to risk her life for someone who might not make it back in time. Ainz thought about her father, how he always spoke highly of Nola, as if this young man was the embodiment of all the noble qualities she longed to attain. Her father, Dandalg, was a wise and experienced man, and she realized that he probably knew far more about Nola than she would have guessed. Her mind swirled with thoughts of the king and the prince, who also had a high opinion of Nola and his incredible strength, which caused her to have mixed feelings of envy and frustration, wanting to be as strong and brave as he was. When Ainz first saw the dragon, her heart froze and her mind was gripped by cold fear. In the same instant, she realized that Null would be no match for this monster that towered above them like a living mountain emitting a menacing roar. Despite her inner impulses, she did not stop him, and this inaction cut her heart like a sharp razor. In Ain's mind surfaced the thought that if Null was an idiot for his careless actions, then she was no better, a fool for letting him go to his certain death without making the slightest effort to keep him safe. Events moved too quickly, and Ainz, immersed in thought, suddenly heard a strange sound piercing the air. The sound was so out of place in the situation that she froze for a moment, not believing her ears. It was impossible for Null, who was in the heart of the poison cloud, to continue fighting the dragon. She looked ahead, straining all her senses, and seemed to notice silver streaks breaking through the darkness of the battle. Those streaks reminded her of hope, of the light they all sought in this dark world. Ainz thought again of Nola, the same young man who had been recognized by her father as a brave and worthy warrior. His bravery had always admired her, but now that he was on the brink of death, that admiration had turned to horror and hopelessness. Null continued to fight the dragon as if ignoring the threat hanging over his head. Ainz and Rin stared dumbfounded at Null, unable to believe their eyes. However, joy was quickly drowned out by sadness when Ains realized that despite his courage, it might all be futile. Inhaling the poison that filled the air was deadly. She realized that even the holy potion created to heal and protect him could not save him in such a critical situation. Nevertheless, Null continued to fight as if ignoring the threat looming over his head, and his unwavering determination only added to Ain's sense of hopelessness. Suddenly, something hit her magic shield powerfully, causing her to flinch in surprise. It was a dragon's claw, vicious and deadly, which, piercing through the defense, left behind cracks and wobbles. Null continued to fight the dragon, his sword whistling through the air, and he delivered blows that seemed to be full of desperate power. Ains looked at him, her heart clenched with fear and admiration at the same time. She could see that he was still holding on to the poison cloud, although his movements were becoming increasingly slow and uncertain. His body had clearly weakened, but even in this state he continued to fight. Ains thought that not even an idiot would be enough to describe his actions. Null, risking his life to save others, showed unimaginable bravery and selflessness. No matter how foolish it was to sacrifice herself to save a stranger, the act became the epitome of the ideal she had been striving for all her life. Ains looked at Nola, full of conflicting feelings. She realized that everything was coming to an end, and in this struggle they might not survive. The dragon, sensing its power, continued to loom over Nola, its majestic and menacing body looming over him, about to deliver a crushing blow. But Null, gathering all his remaining strength, thrust his sword forward, preparing for one last battle, as if his determination could stop all the evil coming from the dragon. In the next second, as Null swung his sword, Ains swooned with fear and hope. His movement was filled not only with physical strength, but also with a spirit that seemed to be able to battle evil itself. He severed the dragon's paw, and the monster's powerful roar rang out through the air. However, Null, having lost all his strength, collapsed to the ground, and his body seemed to have lost all life, as if the whole world around him had collapsed, leaving behind only ash and destruction. The dragon, sensing the loss of his power, prepared for the final blow that could finally break his opponent. Null, looking at his hand, realized how life was slipping away from him, and the fear that had once restrained him was being replaced by a strange peace encompassing him. Only one thought arose in his mind. Perhaps this would be better. Perhaps he would finally find peace in the world where he had always been haunted by suffering and pain.